The room smelled like expensive cigars and cheaper threats. 5 men sat around a table in a Manhattan steakhouse, the kind of place where the maitre d' knew not to remember faces, where conversations happened that never officially occurred. The year was 1935. The men were the most powerful gangsters in America. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and Dutch Schultz, who was about to say something that would seal his fate, though he didn't know it yet. They were discussing territory. Who controlled what? Who paid tribute to whom? The usual business of organized crime. And then Schultz brought up Harlem, the numbers racket. Millions of dollars flowing through black hands in a neighborhood 100 blocks north. He was laughing as he said it, actually laughing. Like the idea of black people controlling anything worth taking was the funniest joke he'd heard all week. "They're running penny-ante operations," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Street-level hustlers who don't know the first thing about real organization, I'm taking it. All of it. And there's not a damn thing they can do about it." The other men nodded, some of them smiling, because everyone knew the hierarchy: Italians at the top, Jews right below them, Irish getting squeezed out but still dangerous. And black criminals, they weren't even in the conversation. They were allowed to run numbers in their own neighborhoods, small-time gambling operations that the real mob didn't care about. Kids playing gangster while the adults ran the real rackets. That was the understanding. That was the natural order. That was how it had always been. Schultz stubbed out his cigar. "I'll have it locked down in 6 months," he said. "They'll fold. They always do." But what Dutch Schultz didn't know, what none of them understood, was that at that exact moment, 100 blocks north in Harlem, a woman named Stephanie St. Clair was counting the day's receipts from her numbers operation. And the number she wrote in her ledger wasn't hundreds of dollars. It was $15,000. From one day, from one of 40 different numbers, banks she controlled across Harlem. She was sitting in an apartment that would make those mobsters' social clubs look shabby. Fur coats in the closet, diamond rings on her fingers, a loaded pistol in her desk drawer, and a reputation that made grown men nervous. They called her Queenie. They called her Madame St. Clair, and they called her when they had problems that required someone who didn't scare easy. She'd built an empire, a real one, with accounting ledgers and employee hierarchies and weekly payouts that dwarfed what most legitimate businesses in Harlem were making. She employed hundreds of people, fed thousands of families, owned property, bought politicians, and she'd done it all without asking permission from a single white gangster because she didn't think she needed permission to be great. That same night, a man named Casper Holstein was having dinner with Langston Hughes. Actually having dinner at a nice restaurant, discussing poetry and politics and the future of black culture in America. Holstein had paid for the publication of Hughes's first book of poetry. He'd funded the Harlem Renaissance Cultural Awards. He'd bought buildings so black families could own property. He'd donated to the NAACP, and he'd done it all with money from the numbers racket. Illegal gambling profits, funding legal black excellence. And nobody in that steakhouse downtown had any idea it was happening. They thought Harlem was a slum full of street criminals. They had no concept that an entire parallel economy was functioning, thriving, building wealth and culture and power without their permission or oversight. And in a pool hall on 142nd Street, a young man named Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was playing 8-ball and planning violence. He was 30 years old. He'd already done time in Sing Sing. Already built a reputation as someone you didn't cross unless you were suicidal. He worked for Stephanie St. Clair as muscle, as an enforcer, as the man you sent when talking was over and action was required. And he was smart. Street smart. Chess smart. The kind of intelligence that doesn't come from books, but from surviving when survival requires you to think 3 moves ahead or die. He knew Dutch Schultz was coming. Everyone knew. The whispers had been circulating for months. The white mob wanted Harlem. And Bumpy Johnson was already planning what he'd do when they arrived. Not if. When. Because men like Schultz always came. Always thought they could take what they wanted. Always underestimated the people they were taking it from. That's the moment we're stepping into. 1935. The edge of a war that would reshape organized crime in America. A war between the most powerful white gangsters in New York and black criminals they didn't even consider worth worrying about. A war that would end with bodies in the streets, empires rising and falling, and a complete restructuring of who held power in the American underworld. Because what the mob didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly grasp, was that Harlem wasn't a territory to be conquered. It was a nation with its own economy, its own rules, its own kings and queens. And you don't just walk into a nation and declare yourself emperor without consequences. They said black gangsters were small time, street-level hustlers who'd never understand real organized crime. They said Harlem was easy pickings, that the colored criminals would fold the moment real gangsters showed up. They said a black woman running numbers was cute, that a black banker was playing dress-up, that black enforcers were just muscle without brains. They said all of this with complete confidence, because the system had taught them that black people couldn't build anything lasting, couldn't organize anything complex, couldn't fight back against real power. The entire structure of American society reinforced this belief. Every institution confirmed it. So why would organized crime be any different? But they were about to learn something that would cost some of them their lives, that Harlem had already built an empire, that a queen, a banker, and a street legend were already sitting at their own table, and they had no intention of giving up their seats. This is the story of how Harlem's gangsters forced the mob to recognize black power. Not by asking, not by begging, not by waiting for permission, but by building something so undeniable, so powerful, so profitable, that even the most racist mobsters had to acknowledge it. This is the story of the underground economy that funded the Harlem Renaissance. The criminals who protected black culture. The outlaws who proved that excellence has no color, even in the underworld. This is the story of Stephanie St. Clair, who went to war with the mob and refused to surrender, of Casper Holstein, who turned illegal profits into black institutional power, of Bumpy Johnson, who became the first black gangster to sit as an equal with the Italian Mafia. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The complex, violent, brilliant, ruthless story of how Harlem built its own empire and forced America to recognize it. By the time this story is over, the mob's hierarchy would be shattered, the rules would be rewritten, and the men who sat in that steakhouse laughing at the idea of black gangsters would be dead, in prison, or bowing to the very people they'd dismissed. But to understand how this happened, how a community dismissed as inferior built an empire that rivaled anything the Italian or Jewish mobs created, you need to go back before the war, back before the empire, back to the moment when Harlem became Harlem, back to the Great Migration, back to Prohibition, back to the birth of the Harlem Renaissance, back to when everything changed, and nothing would ever be the same. The South was a trap, not a metaphor, an actual trap designed to keep black Americans in a permanent state of controlled poverty that looked different from slavery, but functioned almost identically. Sharecropping kept families in perpetual debt. Jim Crow laws kept them politically powerless. Lynch mobs kept them terrified. The entire system was architected to ensure that the children of former slaves remained as close to enslaved as legally possible. Economic mobility didn't exist. Political representation was a joke. Physical safety was conditional on staying invisible, staying quiet, staying in your place. And that place was the bottom. Always the bottom. This was the South. This was home. This was hell. But then something remarkable happened. Something that would reshape American history. Black people started leaving. Not a few families here and there, not a trickle. A flood. An exodus. What historians would later call the Great Migration. The movement of 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the urban North between 1916 and 1976. Million people saying no. No to sharecropping. No to Jim Crow. No to lynch mobs. No to a system designed to break them. They packed their lives into cardboard suitcases and wooden trunks. They boarded segregated trains heading north, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Philadelphia, to Cleveland, and to New York City, to Harlem. They came for jobs in factories that didn't care about skin color as much as they cared about production quotas. They came for schools that might actually educate their children. They came for the possibility, however slim, of building something better than what the South allowed. They came because staying meant accepting a future already written, a destiny already determined, a life already lost. Harlem became the capital of this new Black America. Not the largest Black community, Chicago held that title, but the most symbolic, the most culturally significant, the place where Black excellence would be most visible. By 1920, Harlem had transformed from a white middle-class neighborhood into the largest Black urban community in America. Apartment buildings that had housed white families now housed Black families from Georgia, from Alabama, from Mississippi, from the Carolinas. The streets filled with Southern accents and Northern dreams. Brownstones packed with people who'd never lived in a building with electricity before, with running water, with heat, with hope. The population density was crushing. Multiple families sharing apartments designed for one. But it was theirs. Black-owned businesses started appearing. Black churches, Black newspapers, Black culture exploding in every direction. And underneath all of it, hidden from the official histories, but absolutely essential to understanding what happened, an underground economy was forming. Because here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize the Great Migration. These families arrived in New York with nothing. Less than nothing debt from the South chasing them. No jobs waiting. No safety net. The legitimate economy was largely closed to them. Bank loans, denied. Union jobs. Whites-only professional careers. Don't be ridiculous. Most Black men who could find work ended up as porters, janitors, laborers. Black women as domestic servants, cleaning white people's homes for pennies. The American dream was available, just not to them. So they built their own economy, an underground version, parallel to the legitimate one, but operating by different rules. And the foundation of this underground economy was numbers, the numbers racket, the policy game, illegal gambling that would become the economic engine of Harlem. Here's how it worked. People bet small amounts, sometimes just pennies, on a 3-digit number. If your number hit, you won. The odds were terrible, roughly 600 to 1 against you. But the payout was good, often 500 or 600 to 1. And critically, you could play for pennies. A nickel bet could win you $25. A quarter could win you $125. For people making $10 a week, that kind of win was transformative. Could pay rent, buy food, get your kids' shoes, survive another month. So people played, everybody played. Numbers runners would come through tenement buildings every morning, collecting bets, paying out winners. The entire community participated, and someone had to run this operation. Someone had to collect the bets, calculate the payouts, hold the money, manage the runners. Someone had to build an organization. In most American cities, white gangsters controlled the numbers racket in Black neighborhoods. They hired Black frontmen, Black runners, but the real money flowed to white criminals who owned the operation. But Harlem was different, because Harlem had Casper Holstein. Holstein arrived in Harlem from the Virgin Islands in 1913. He was 23 years old. He worked as a porter, then a doorman, saving every dollar. He was educated, sophisticated, spoke multiple languages, and he was ambitious. Not just for himself, for Black people generally. He believed in Marcus Garvey's vision of Black economic independence. He believed in W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of the talented tenth. He believed that Black people needed their own institutions, their own businesses, their own economic power base, and he saw the numbers racket as seed capital, as the way to fund everything else. So in 1920, he started his own numbers bank. He called it Bolito, a Caribbean name that connected to his Virgin Islands roots. And he ran it honestly. Well, as honestly as an illegal gambling operation could be run. He paid winners immediately. He kept meticulous records. He didn't cheat. Word spread. Holstein's game was square. You could trust him. By 1925, Casper Holstein was the biggest numbers banker in Harlem. They called him the Bolito King. He was making $500,000 a year. In 1920s, money. That's roughly $8 million a year in today's currency from illegal gambling. And here's what made Holstein different from every other gangster in America, black or white. He gave it away, not all of it. He wasn't stupid. He lived well. Nice apartment, nice clothes, nice life. But he poured enormous amounts of money into Harlem's legitimate institutions. He bought buildings and rented them to black families at fair rates. He funded black newspapers. He created the Holstein Awards for black writers and artists. He personally financed the publication of Langston Hughes's first poetry collection. He donated to the NAACP. He paid for kids to go to college. He attended intellectual salons with poets and writers and activists. He was part of the Harlem Renaissance, not as an artist, but as a patron, as a financier, as the man whose illegal money kept legal black culture alive. And this created something unprecedented in American history. A gangster who was also a pillar of the community. A criminal who was also a philanthropist. An outlaw who was also respected by intellectuals. The legitimate and illegitimate worlds overlapping in ways that would have been impossible in white society, but made perfect sense in Harlem. Because in Harlem, survival required creativity. Required using every resource available. Required not caring too much about where the money came from as long as it helped the community. Holstein proved that the numbers racket could be more than exploitation, could be economic development, could be black capitalism in its rawest, most functional form. And he wasn't alone. By the mid-1920s, Harlem had over 30 different numbers bankers, some small-time, some substantial, and one of them was about to become a legend. Her name was Stephanie St. Clair, and she gave absolutely zero damns about what anyone thought she should or shouldn't do. Stephanie St. Clair was born in Martinique around 1897. The exact date is unclear because record-keeping in the French Caribbean wasn't precise for black families. What is clear is that she came from nothing, poverty that made American poverty look generous. She immigrated to the United States in 1912, arriving in New York at age 15 with $10 and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. She found work as a domestic servant, cleaning white people's houses, washing their clothes, raising their children, while her own dreams stayed locked in a box she couldn't open. The work was brutal. The pay was insulting. The treatment was degrading. White women spoke to her like she was property, like she was stupid, like she should be grateful for the opportunity to scrub their floors. And Stephanie St. Clair learned something essential during those years. She learned to hate, not a hot rage that burns itself out. A cold, calculated hatred. The kind that waits. The kind that plans. The kind that remembers every slight, every insult, every moment of being treated as less than human. And the kind that swears revenge. By 1923, she was done with legitimate work. Done with bosses. Done with being anyone's servant. She'd saved a small amount of money, and she'd been watching. Watching how the numbers racket worked. Watching how the runners collected bets. Watching how the bankers operated. Watching how money flowed through Harlem in rivers that never reached the people generating it. She saw an opportunity. More than an opportunity. A weapon. A way to take control of her own life, and maybe, just maybe, help other people take control of theirs. She started small. One numbers bank. A handful of runners. Operating out of a tenement apartment. She was a woman in a male-dominated criminal world. She was an immigrant in a community suspicious of outsiders. She was going up against established bankers who didn't appreciate new competition. None of it mattered. Because Stephanie St. Clair had something most gangsters, regardless of color or gender, never developed. Discipline. Absolute. Terrifying discipline. She kept records like she was running General Motors. Ledgers for every transaction. Names of every runner. Amounts collected daily. Payouts tracked to the penny. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't party. While other gangsters were spending money on flash and status, She was reinvesting in her operation, hiring more runners, opening more banks, building an infrastructure that could scale. And she was ruthless about honesty. She paid winners immediately, every time, no exceptions. In an industry where cheating customers was standard practice, St. Clair ran a square game. You hit your number, you got paid. No arguments, no delays, no excuses. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. Because when people trust you, they come back. They tell their friends. Your operation grows. And in the numbers racket, growth meant power. By 1926, 3 years after starting, Stephanie St. Clair controlled multiple numbers banks across Harlem. She employed over 40 runners. She was clearing thousands of dollars a week, and people noticed. The men who dismissed her as a woman playing gangster were watching their operations shrink while hers expanded. The established bankers who thought she'd fold under pressure were realizing she didn't know how to fold. But more importantly, the community noticed, because St. Clair wasn't like other bankers. She fought back against the real enemy. The NYPD, the corrupt cops who shook down numbers operators for protection money, who arrested runners, seized cash, and kept it for themselves, who beat black suspects and planted evidence and lied in court. The cops who made Harlem's life hell. Most numbers bankers paid the cops. It was the cost of doing business. You handed over a percentage, and they left you alone. St. Clair refused. When corrupt cops came demanding payoffs, she threatened to expose them, and she meant it. She took out advertisements in black newspapers listing the names of dirty cops publishing their badge numbers, describing their shakedown operations, making them famous in the worst possible way. This was insane. This was suicidal. This was a black woman, a criminal, publicly attacking the New York City Police Department. Every criminal in Harlem told her to stop. Every advisor she had begged her to pay the cops and move on. She didn't listen. Because Stephanie St. Clair had decided something early in her life. She'd rather die than bow. To anyone. For any reason. The cops tried to destroy her. Arrested her repeatedly. Raided her operations. Seized her money. Threw her in jail. She kept coming back. Kept reopening. Kept publishing their names. Kept fighting. And something remarkable happened. The community rallied around her. Harlem residents started seeing her not as a criminal, but as a warrior. As someone fighting the real oppressors. The cops might have badges, but they were the ones stealing from Harlem families. St. Clair might run an illegal gambling operation, but she paid her debts and employed her neighbors and stood up to the people everyone else feared. By the late 1920s, Stephanie St. Clair was more than a numbers banker. She was a folk hero. People called her Queenie, Madame St. Clair, the woman who wouldn't bow, the woman who fought cops and won, the woman who proved that black people didn't have to accept being victims. And she was about to need every ounce of that fighting spirit. Because while she was building her empire and battling corrupt cops, a much more dangerous enemy was watching a white gangster named Dutch Schultz, a man so violent, so unpredictable, so vicious that even other mobsters thought he was psychotic, and he'd decided he wanted Harlem. Wanted the numbers racket, wanted everything St. Clair and Holstein and the other black bankers had built, and he assumed, like everyone else, that black criminals would fold the moment real gangsters showed up. He was about to learn otherwise, and it would cost him everything. By 1930, Stephanie St. Clair wasn't just running a numbers operation. She was running the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in Harlem 42, numbers banks across the neighborhood, each one functioning like a franchise, with its own staff, its own territory, its own daily take. She employed over 100 people directly, hundreds more indirectly. Runners who collected bets, writers who recorded numbers, controllers who managed the banks, enforcers who protected the operation. An entire economy built on 3-digit numbers and the desperate hope of poor people trying to catch a break. The money was staggering. On an average day, St. Clair's operation collected between $5,000 and $15,000 in bets. some days more. The payout to winners was roughly 40% of the take operating costs, runner salaries, bank expenses, another 30%, which left her with approximately 30% profit. Do the math. Even on a conservative day, she was clearing $1,500 to $4,500 in pure profit daily. That's $45,000 to $135,000 a month. In 1930 money. When the average American worker was making $1,500 a year, Stephanie St. Clair was making that in a single day, a black woman, an immigrant, someone the system had declared worthless. She was pulling in more cash than most legitimate businesses in New York City. And she flaunted it. Not stupidly, strategically. She wore fur coats that cost more than most people's annual salary. Diamond rings, silk dresses. She lived in a beautiful apartment filled with expensive furniture. She drove nice cars, ate at good restaurants, lived openly, visibly, unapologetically wealthy. This wasn't ego. Well, it wasn't just ego. It was messaging. It was showing every black person in Harlem that wealth was possible. That a black woman could be rich, could be powerful, could tell white people no and survive, could build an empire without asking permission. The fur coats were propaganda. The diamonds were revolution. Every time Stephanie St. Clair walked down Lenox Avenue looking like money, she was proving something that American society insisted was impossible. But here's what made her different from every other gangster getting rich off Harlem. She gave back. Not like Holstein, who was funding high culture and intellectual movements, St. Clair gave back to the streets, to the people playing her numbers. She employed Harlem residents exclusively, wouldn't hire anyone from outside the community. If you worked for Madame St. Clair, you lived in Harlem. You were black. You were family. She paid her people well, better than other banks. Her runners made more than runners working for other operations. Her controllers got bonuses. Loyalty was rewarded with money, not just words. When Harlem families couldn't pay rent, she helped. Quietly. Didn't advertise it. But people knew. If you were in trouble, if you'd been playing her numbers and treating her people right, Madame St. Clair might pay your rent, might buy your kid shoes, might keep you from being evicted. This wasn't charity. It was community building. It was creating a network of people who were invested in her success because her success meant their survival. And she protected the community from the real predators. The corrupt cops were the obvious target. She never stopped fighting them, never stopped publishing their names, never stopped making them pay a price for shaking down Harlem. But there were other predators too. White gangsters from downtown who'd come uptown looking for easy marks. Small-time hustlers who'd rob people on payday. Stick-up men who thought Harlem was soft. St. Clair had enforcers. Not many. She wasn't running an army, but enough, and they had a reputation. You rob someone in St. Clair's territory, you answer to her people. And her people didn't play. They didn't kill unnecessarily. That was bad for business. But they hurt people, made examples, sent messages. Harlem residents knew that Madame St. Clair's numbers, banks, were safe. You could play without fear. Could walk to the numbers spot with cash in your pocket and not worry about getting robbed. Because St. Clair's people were watching. This created loyalty that money couldn't buy. The community protected her because she protected them. When the cops raided her operations, neighbors would warn her, would hide her records, would lie to investigators, would refuse to testify. Harlem became her fortress, not because she built walls, but because she built trust. By 1931, Stephanie St. Clair was the second largest numbers banker in Harlem, right behind Casper Holstein. And unlike Holstein, who was declining after his 1926 kidnapping, St. Clair was ascending, expanding, getting stronger. She'd proven that a woman could run a criminal empire, that a black person could build institutional power without white oversight, that the underworld didn't have to be exploitative, could be, in its own twisted way, community-oriented. She'd become a symbol, not of criminality, but of black independence, of refusing to accept the limitations society imposed, of building power where power wasn't supposed to exist. But symbols attract attention, and power attracts predators. The Italian and Jewish mobs downtown had been watching Harlem's numbers racket for years, watching the money flow, calculating the profits, seeing an opportunity. For a long time, they'd left it alone. Harlem was black territory. The numbers game was small time in their eyes. They had bigger concerns: bootlegging during Prohibition, union rackets, legitimate businesses they controlled. Why bother with penny-ante gambling in a black neighborhood? But Prohibition ended in 1933. The enormous profits from bootlegging disappeared overnight. The mob needed new revenue streams, and suddenly Harlem's numbers racket didn't look small time anymore. It looked like millions of dollars flowing through black hands' money that could be flowing through white hands. Money that should be flowing through white hands. Because that was the natural order. White gangsters on top, everyone else paying tribute. Dutch Schultz was the first to move. Arthur Flegenheimer, his real name. But everyone called him Dutch Schultz, or just the Dutchman. He was 33 years old in 1931, Jewish, born in the Bronx. He'd built an empire during Prohibition, running beer and bootleg liquor across New York. He was worth millions. He was feared by everyone who knew him, because Dutch Schultz was genuinely crazy. Not metaphorically. Clinically. The man had no impulse control, no sense of proportion, no understanding of when violence was counterproductive. He'd murder people for minor insults. He once beat a man to death with a baseball bat in a restaurant full of witnesses because the man had looked at him wrong. His own associates were terrified of him. Lucky Luciano, who'd killed dozens of people without blinking, thought Schultz was dangerously unbalanced. That's who was looking at Harlem. That's who decided he wanted the numbers racket. A psychopath with unlimited resources and no conscience. Schultz started hearing about Harlem's numbers from his own associates, from cops on his payroll, from other mobsters who'd done the math. The numbers racket in Harlem was generating an estimated $100 million a year in total bets. Even after payouts and expenses, the profits were in the tens of millions, and it was being run by black operators who, in Schultz's mind, had no right to control anything that valuable. He said it out loud, multiple times, to multiple people. Used racial slurs that were common for the time, but are unacceptable now. Made it clear he viewed black people as inferior, as temporary custodians of money that rightfully belonged to white criminals, as obstacles to be removed. He started planning his takeover in late 1931, sent people to Harlem to scout the operations, to identify the major banks, to map the territory, to find the pressure points. And the reports came back clear. The biggest operators were Casper Holstein, who was fading, and Stephanie St. Clair, who was rising. Schultz made his decision. He'd take them all. Every numbers bank in Harlem. He'd force the operators to sell to him, or he'd destroy them. And he assumed, like everyone else, that they'd sell. Because who fights Dutch Schultz? Who goes to war with a connected white gangster backed by the entire Italian and Jewish mob infrastructure? What choice did they have? In early 1932, Schultz's men started showing up in Harlem. Not subtly. They wanted to be seen, wanted to send a message. Well-dressed white men walking into numbers banks, asking to speak to the owner. The message was simple and consistent. Mr. Schultz is taking over the numbers in Harlem. You can sell your operation for a fair price, or we'll take it for nothing. Your choice. Most of the smaller operators sold, immediately, took whatever Schultz offered and got out. They weren't fighters, they were businessmen, and fighting Dutch Schultz was suicide. Within months, Schultz had absorbed over a dozen small numbers banks, was installing his own people to run them, was collecting the profits, was proving his theory that Harlem would fold without a fight. But two people didn't sell, Casper Holstein and Stephanie St. Clair. Holstein, despite his declining health and increasing paranoia after the 1926 kidnapping, refused on principle he'd built the Harlem numbers racket, had poured his life into it, had used the profits to uplift the community, and he wouldn't hand it over to a white gangster who'd never done anything for Harlem except exploit it. His refusal was quiet. dignified. He simply said no and increased his security. St. Clair's refusal was different. It was loud. It was public. It was defiant in a way that made even her allies nervous. When Schultz's men came to her apartment to make the offer, she pulled out a pistol and pointed it at them. Told them to get out. Told them to tell Schultz that Stephanie St. Clair didn't work for anyone, didn't bow to anyone, and if he wanted her operation, he could try to take it, but it would cost him. The men left, shocked. They reported back to Schultz, and Schultz, predictably, lost his mind, started screaming, started smashing furniture, started ranting about disrespectful N-words who didn't know their place. How dare a black woman point a gun at his people? How dare she say no? How dare she act like she had any power in this situation? He gave the order. Destroy her. Not just take her operation. Destroy her personally. Make an example. Show all of Harlem what happens when you defy Dutch Schultz. And that's when the war started. The war that would reshape organized crime in New York. The war that would prove black gangsters weren't just playing at crime. They were the real thing. As dangerous as anyone. As committed as anyone. As willing to die as anyone. Stephanie St. Clair had spent a decade building her empire. She'd fought cops. She'd fought competitors. She'd fought poverty and racism and every limitation society placed on black women. And now she was about to fight the most dangerous white gangster in America. Most people thought she'd last a month, maybe 2. They had no idea who they were dealing with, because Stephanie St. Clair had been preparing for this fight her entire life, and she had absolutely no intention of losing. Dutch Schultz didn't do subtle takeovers. He didn't negotiate. He didn't play political games. He did violence. Overwhelming, theatrical, terrifying violence designed to break your will before it broke your body. That was his signature. That was his brand. And in March 1932, he unleashed it on Stephanie St. Clair's operation. It started with her runners, the people who collected bets every morning, walking through tenement buildings with notebooks and cash. They were unarmed. They were civilians, really. Just Harlem residents making a living. Schultz's men found them, followed them, waited until they'd collected the day's bets, when they were carrying the most cash, then robbed them, beat them, sometimes killed them, not because they resisted. As a message. 3 of St. Clair's runners were murdered in the first 2 weeks, just shot in the street and left there. The money taken, the notebooks destroyed, the message clear. Then came the bombs, actual bombs. Schultz had people who specialized in this. Dynamite and numbers banks. Small explosives that wouldn't kill everyone in a building, but would destroy the location, terrorize the neighborhood, make it clear that playing St. Clair's numbers meant risking your life. 4 of her banks were bombed in a month. Buildings damaged. People injured. 1 woman killed when she happened to be walking past when the bomb went off. The NYPD barely investigated. Some of the cops were on Schultz's payroll. The rest didn't care about black gambling operations. Or black lives, for that matter. Harlem was on its own. St. Clair's other banks started closing. The people running them were terrified. They wanted out. She couldn't blame them, couldn't guarantee their safety, couldn't promise that Schultz wouldn't kill them and their families. So they folded, sold to Schultz, went to work for him, betrayed her because survival mattered more than loyalty. Within 3 months, St. Clair had lost more than half her operation. 25 banks reduced to 10. Her income cut by more than 60%. Her empire crumbling. And everyone, every single person in Harlem's underworld told her the same thing. Sell. Take whatever Schultz is offering. Get out alive. You fought. You lost. It's over. Live to fight another day. Even Casper Holstein, who'd also refused to sell, was wavering. Was considering his options. Was thinking about his safety. St. Clair was isolated, facing the most powerful white gangster in New York, watching her people die, watching her empire collapse. Any reasonable person would have surrendered, but Stephanie St. Clair had never been reasonable. She'd been called crazy her entire life for fighting the cops, for refusing to bow, for thinking a black woman could build and keep an empire in a world designed to prevent exactly that. And if this was crazy, if refusing to surrender to a racist psychopath was insanity, then she'd be crazy until the day she died. But she wasn't stupid. She knew she couldn't fight Schultz alone, couldn't protect her remaining banks with just her small enforcement crew, couldn't match his resources, his manpower, his connections. She needed help. She needed someone who understood violence at Schultz's level, someone who wouldn't fold under pressure, someone as committed to fighting as she was. She needed Bumpy Johnson, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. 27 years old, already a legend in Harlem, though most of the world had never heard his name. He'd grown up in South Carolina, moved to Harlem in 1919 as a teenager, got into street crime immediately. Robbing, fighting, surviving. By 15, he was in Sing Sing prison for armed robbery. Did 10 years. Hard years. Learned how to fight in prison. How to lead. How to command respect through controlled violence. He got out in 1930 and came back to Harlem different, harder, smarter, more dangerous. He was small. 5'9", maybe 140 pounds. Didn't look intimidating. But he moved like violence. Like every gesture was a potential attack. He had a bump on the back of his head from a childhood injury, which is where the nickname came from. Bumpy. But the nickname was deceptive, made him sound harmless. He was anything but. Bumpy Johnson had a reputation by 1932. He'd killed people. Nobody knew exactly how many. Bumpy didn't brag, but the word was out. You crossed him, you disappeared, you disrespected him, you got hurt. You tried to move in on his territory. You ended up in the hospital or the morgue. And critically, Bumpy was strategic. He didn't kill randomly. Didn't use violence for ego. Used it as a tool. Calculated, precise, effective. St. Clair had hired him as muscle in 1931, before the war with Schultz. He'd been working for her for a year, protecting her banks, handling problems, proving himself. And she'd noticed something about him. He was smart, not just street smart, genuinely intelligent. He could read people, could think 3 moves ahead, could plan operations that actually worked. He was wasted as just an enforcer. He could be a general. She called him to her apartment in April 1932, laid out the situation. Schultz was coming for her, had already destroyed half her operation, would destroy the rest unless she fought back. But fighting back meant war. Real war. Not street fights. Not isolated incidents. Organized violence against the most dangerous white gangster in New York, Schultz, had dozens of men. Had political connections. Had the Italian mob backing him. Had unlimited resources. Fighting him was probably suicidal. Definitely dangerous. Almost certainly futile. She asked Bumpy if he'd lead her soldiers. If he'd go to war against Dutch Schultz. Knowing what it meant. Knowing the odds. Knowing he'd probably die. Bumpy Johnson listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't ask questions. Just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that would become legendary in Harlem. Would be repeated for decades. Would define his entire approach to life and crime and power. I'd rather die standing than live on my knees. That was his answer. That was his commitment. He'd fight. Not because he thought they'd win, because he refused to bow. St. Clair gave him control of her remaining enforcement crew. About 15 men, all Harlem residents, all black, all willing to die rather than surrender their neighborhood to white gangsters. Bumpy studied Schultz's operation, how his men moved through Harlem, where they went, when they were vulnerable, what they cared about, and he planned. Because Bumpy understood something that most people didn't. Dutch Schultz had advantages. Money, manpower, connections. But Bumpy had one advantage Schultz couldn't match Harlem itself. The community, the streets, the people who lived there. This was Bumpy's home. He knew every alley, every building, every person he could move through Harlem invisible. Could get intelligence from residents who hated the white gangsters taking over their neighborhood. Could strike and disappear before Schultz's men even knew what happened. Guerrilla warfare. That was the strategy. Not meeting Schultz head-on, he'd win that fight, but hitting and running, destroying his operations, making Harlem so expensive to control that it wasn't worth it. The counterattack started in May 1932. Schultz had taken over several of St. Clair's former banks, installed his own people to run them. White managers, white collectors, and Harlem residents hated it. Hated playing numbers with white men who treated them like garbage, who shorted payouts, who disrespected them, who called them slurs while taking their money. Bumpy used that anger. Started with small hits. Schultz's runners getting robbed, his collectors getting beaten, his money getting stolen. Nothing huge, just constant pressure, a death by 1,000 cuts. Then he escalated. One of Schultz's numbers banks was in a building on 145th Street. The manager was a white guy named Eddie, who'd been particularly brutal to Harlem residents. Bumpy's crew waited until closing, until Eddie was alone, counting the day's take. They walked in, shot him, took all the money, burned the records, disappeared into Harlem before Schultz's people even knew it happened. Schultz went ballistic, started hunting for the shooters, offering rewards, threatening Harlem residents, demanding information. Nobody talked, because Harlem residents weren't protecting Bumpy out of fear. They were protecting him because he was protecting them, because he was fighting their enemy, because he represented resistance. Schultz couldn't understand it, couldn't grasp why people would risk his wrath to protect a criminal. Didn't understand that to Harlem residents, Bumpy wasn't the criminal Schultz was. The war intensified. Schultz sent more men to Harlem. Bumpy killed them. Schultz bombed more of St. Clair's banks. Bumpy destroyed Schultz's operations downtown. Schultz tried to have Bumpy arrested. The cops couldn't find him. He moved through Harlem like a ghost, sleeping in different apartments every night, protected by a community that viewed him as a hero. The white mob watched, increasingly alarmed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Black criminals weren't supposed to fight back, weren't supposed to be this organized, this effective, this dangerous. Lucky Luciano, who was rising to power in the Italian mob, was particularly interested. He saw what nobody else saw, that Bumpy Johnson was actually good at this, that he wasn't just a street thug, he was a strategist, a leader, someone who could organize resistance, someone who could win. By late 1932, the war had reached a stalemate. Schultz controlled about 60% of Harlem's numbers. St. Clair still held on to maybe 20%. The rest was divided among smaller operators or had shut down entirely. But Schultz's takeover was costing him more than he'd expected. He was losing men, losing money, spending more on security and enforcement than he was making in profits. And Harlem residents were boycotting his numbers, playing less, refusing to cooperate, making his operation unprofitable. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to walk in, take over, start collecting. Instead, he was in a war that had no end in sight. Against a black woman who wouldn't surrender and a young enforcer who kept killing his people. Schultz made a decision. If violence wasn't working, he'd use the law. He paid off the cops, paid off judges, paid off prosecutors. And in January 1933, Stephanie St. Clair was arrested on multiple counts, running an illegal gambling operation, conspiracy, assault, charges that could send her to prison for years. The trial was a joke. The evidence was fabricated. The witnesses were paid off. The verdict was predetermined, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 2 to 8 years in prison to be served immediately. Madame St. Clair, the Queen of Harlem, was going to jail, and Dutch Schultz thought he'd finally won. He didn't know Stephanie St. Clair very well, because even from prison, even locked in a cell, even facing years behind bars, she was still fighting. And she had one more move to make, one that would change everything. Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, February 1933. Stephanie St. Clair sat in a prison cell 30 miles north of the Harlem Empire. The cell was small, cold, gray walls, a cot, a toilet, nothing else. This was supposed to break her, supposed to teach her humility, supposed to show her what happens when you refuse to know your place, a black woman, an immigrant, a criminal. Now where she belonged, behind bars, powerless. But the people who thought prison would break Stephanie St. Clair didn't understand her at all, because she'd been in prison her entire life. America was a prison for black people. The South was a prison. Poverty was a prison. Being a woman was a prison. And she'd escaped all of them. A literal prison with bars and guards? That was just more of the same. And she'd been planning for this. Before her arrest, St. Clair had done something no other gangster had thought to do. She'd distributed her assets, given instructions, transferred control. She knew Schultz would come for her eventually, knew the system would be used against her. So she prepared. Her remaining numbers banks were operating under trusted lieutenants. The money was hidden, her records were secured, and most importantly, Bumpy Johnson was still free, still fighting, still making Schultz's life hell. From her cell, St. Clair could still give orders, could still coordinate, could still run her operation through intermediaries and coded messages. The prison guards thought she was isolated. She was more connected than they could imagine. Because Harlem hadn't forgotten her. Visitors came weekly. People bringing messages disguised as family news. Lawyers bringing papers that contained more than legal documents. A whole network keeping her informed, keeping her in the game. And she used that time to do something strategic. Something that would change the trajectory of the war. She started talking to reporters. Real reporters from black newspapers. The Amsterdam News, the New York Age, the Chicago Defender. Papers that actually covered Harlem. That cared about black communities, that would print what white papers ignored. She gave interviews from prison, told her story, how she'd built a business, how she'd employed hundreds of people, how she'd fought corrupt cops and protected her community, how Dutch Schultz, a white gangster, was using violence to steal what black people had built, how the NYPD was helping him, how the courts were rigged against her, how the entire system was designed to keep black people powerless. She became a folk hero, not despite being in prison, because of it. Every article painted her as a symbol of resistance, a woman who refused to surrender, who fought the system, who chose prison over bowing to white criminals. The stories spread, not just in New York, nationally. Black newspapers across America picked them up. Stephanie St. Clair became famous. Not in white America. They still didn't know she existed. But in black America, she was legendary. And this had a practical effect. Harlem residents completely turned against Schultz. Whatever grudging acceptance his takeover had received evaporated. People stopped playing his numbers, started actively sabotaging his operations, giving Bumpy information, protecting his soldiers, making life impossible for Schultz's people. The white gangster who'd thought he could walk into Harlem and take over was discovering that occupying a community that hates you is expensive bloody, ultimately futile. His profits from Harlem were declining. His costs were increasing, and his reputation was suffering, because word was getting out in the underworld. Dutch Schultz, the feared white gangster, was struggling to control Harlem, was losing to a woman in prison and a young black enforcer, was looking weak, and in the mob, looking weak was death. Meanwhile, Bumpy Johnson was evolving. The war with Schultz had turned him from an enforcer into a leader. He was making decisions. Strategic decisions about when to hit Schultz's operations and when to hold back, about how to allocate his limited resources, about building alliances with other Harlem criminals who also hated Schultz. He was learning politics, the kind of criminal politics that determined who had power and who didn't, and he was good at it. Natural. By 1934, 2 years into the war, Bumpy Johnson was becoming the face of Harlem's resistance. St. Clair was in prison. Holstein was fading. The other bankers had folded, but Bumpy was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to quit. Young black men in Harlem started looking at him differently, not just as a gangster, as a symbol, as proof that you could fight the system and survive, that you didn't have to accept what white people said you could and couldn't have. That power was possible if you were willing to pay the price. But the war was taking a toll. Bumpy had lost people, friends, soldiers who died fighting Schultz. The violence was constant, the danger never ending. And he was starting to understand something crucial. Something that would shape his entire approach to organized crime for the next 3 decades. Violence alone doesn't win. You can kill your enemies, can fight them to a standstill, can make them bleed. But unless you can build something permanent, something institutional, you're just trading bodies. The real power isn't in the gun. It's in the organization, in the relationships, in the ability to create systems that survive beyond individual people. Schultz had power because he was connected to the Italian mob, had their backing, their resources, their political connections. Bumpy was isolated, fighting alone. And isolation, no matter how brave, eventually loses to organization. By 1935, the war had been going on for 3 years. Schultz controlled most of Harlem's numbers, but it wasn't profitable. The constant violence, the community resistance, the security costs. He was spending more than he was making, and he was getting desperate. Desperate men make mistakes. And in October 1935, Dutch Schultz made his final mistake. He wanted to murder Thomas Dewey, the special prosecutor who was investigating mob activities. Dewey was dangerous, was actually prosecuting gangsters successfully, was threatening the entire New York mob infrastructure. Schultz argued that killing Dewey would solve the problem, would send a message, would protect everyone. He brought it to the commission, the ruling body of the Italian Jewish mob. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, the men who actually ran organized crime in New York. And they told him no, absolutely not. Killing a prosecutor would bring federal heat they couldn't survive, would turn them into public enemies, would destroy everything they'd built. Schultz didn't care, couldn't see beyond his immediate problem. Said he'd do it anyway, with or without permission. That sealed his fate. Because the one rule you couldn't break in the mob was defying the commission. You could kill. You could steal. You could do almost anything, but you couldn't act independently. Couldn't threaten the organization for personal reasons. Lucky Luciano made the call. Dutch Schultz had to die. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was in the Palace Chop House in Newark, having a meeting. 2 men walked in, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss and Charlie the Bug Workman Luciano's shooters. They opened fire, killed Schultz and his 3 bodyguards. The hit was clean, professional, over in seconds. Dutch Schultz, the white gangster who'd terrorized Harlem, who'd murdered black people without conscience, who'd thought he could take whatever he wanted, was dead. Shot in a bathroom, dying slowly, painfully. And from Bedford Hills Prison, Stephanie St. Clair sent a telegram to Schultz's wife. Just 1 sentence, a quote from the Bible. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. The Queen, even from prison, even defeated, even locked away, had outlasted her enemy, had survived. And her message was clear. You can imprison me, you can take my empire, you can beat me, but you can't break me, and I'll be here when you're gone. That telegram became legendary, became proof that Stephanie St. Clair was different, was someone who won even when she lost, who fought until the end, who refused to accept defeat even in the face of overwhelming odds. It should have been her moment of triumph, Schultz dead, her enemy destroyed, justice, in its own twisted way, served. But there was a problem, a complication that would change everything. Because Lucky Luciano, the man who'd ordered Schultz killed, wasn't done with Harlem. He'd eliminated a problem, Dutch Schultz's chaos, his unpredictability, his threat to the organization. But Luciano still wanted Harlem's numbers, still saw the profits, still intended to control it. He was just smarter about it than Schultz had been, more strategic, more patient, more willing to work with black gangsters instead of just trying to destroy them. And he knew exactly who to talk to. The man who'd been fighting Schultz for 3 years. The enforcer who'd proven himself smart, tough, strategic. The leader who'd earned Harlem's loyalty. Bumpy Johnson. In late 1935, after Schultz was dead, and before St. Clair got out of prison, Lucky Luciano sent word he wanted a meeting with Bumpy to discuss the future of Harlem's numbers, to discuss partnership, not conquest, partnership. It was the moment everything changed, the moment the rules were rewritten, the moment a black gangster was offered a seat at the table, not as an employee, as a partner. Bumpy had a choice. He could refuse, could keep fighting, could try to maintain black independence in Harlem's underworld, could honor St. Clair's vision of black economic control, or he could accept, could work with the mob, could become part of the system instead of fighting against it, could gain power, protection, resources, could ensure his own survival and prosperity, at the cost of the very independence he'd been fighting for. It was an impossible choice, a compromise that would haunt him for decades. But it was also the reality of power in America. You either worked within the system, or you were destroyed by it. There was no third option. No pure resistance. No complete independence. Just degrees of compromise. Degrees of surrender. Degrees of survival. Bumpy Johnson was about to make the decision that would define his life and reshape organized crime in America. But before we get to that, before we understand what happened next, you need to understand the man offering the deal, Lucky Luciano. The Italian mobster who'd do what Dutch Schultz couldn't, who'd actually integrate the mob, who'd actually share power with black gangsters, not out of kindness, out of cold, calculated self-interest. Because Luciano understood something fundamental, something that would make him one of the most powerful gangsters in American history. That power shared strategically is more valuable than power hoarded selfishly. That bringing people into the organization is smarter than trying to destroy them. That the future of organized crime wasn't racial purity. It was efficiency, profit, organization, and that meant working with anyone who could deliver, regardless of color. Lucky Luciano was born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897. Came to America as a child. Grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in poverty that would have broken most people. But Luciano wasn't most people. He understood something early that most gangsters never figured out. That the old ways were dying. That the future of crime wasn't ethnic gangs fighting each other for scraps. It was organization, cooperation, business principles applied to illegal enterprises. He'd watched the old Mustache Petes, the traditional Italian mobsters, cling to their codes and their ethnic loyalties, and their stupid rules about who you could work with: only Italians, only Sicilians, only people from your village, only family. It was tribal, primitive, and inefficient. Luciano saw the bigger picture. During Prohibition, he'd worked with everyone. Italians, yes, but also Jews. Meyer Lansky became his closest partner, his brother in everything but blood. They worked with Irish gangsters, with Polish bootleggers, with anyone who could deliver. Because Luciano didn't care about ethnic purity, he cared about profit, and profit required organization, not tribalism. In 1931, Luciano did something unprecedented in mob history. He orchestrated the murder of the two most powerful old guard Italian mobsters in New York: Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both were traditional. Both refused to work with non-Italians. Both were fighting a stupid war over who controlled the Italian mob. Luciano killed them both, ended the war, and restructured organized crime in New York from the ground up. He created the Commission, a ruling body made up of the bosses from the five families: the Genovese family, which Luciano controlled, the Gambino family, the Lucchese family, the Colombo family, the Bonanno family, plus representatives from the Jewish mob and other ethnic groups. It was revolutionary, a corporate board for organized crime, where decisions were made collectively, where disputes were arbitrated, where rules were established that everyone followed, where cooperation replaced competition. Luciano made himself the chairman, the first among equals, the boss of bosses, though he never used that title too arrogant, too likely to make enemies. He just ran things, quietly, efficiently, and he made everyone rich, The commission controlled everything in New York unions: docks, gambling, loan sharking, prostitution. By 1935, they were generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. All because Luciano had replaced chaos with order violence with negotiation, ethnic warfare with multi-ethnic cooperation. But Harlem had always been the exception. The commission had left it alone during Prohibition because they were making too much money from bootlegging to care about numbers. Then Schultz had tried to take it over and created a disaster. Lost money, lost men, lost face, and ultimately lost his life. Luciano had watched the entire thing, had seen Schultz underestimate Harlem's gangsters, had seen a black woman and a young enforcer fight the most dangerous white gangster in New York to a standstill, had seen something that impressed him, not the violence. Violence was common, but the organization, the strategy, the community support, the discipline Bumpy Johnson had held Harlem together against overwhelming odds, had kept fighting when any rational person would have surrendered, had proven he understood how power actually works, and Luciano recognized talent when he saw it. After Schultz's death, Luciano controlled Harlem's numbers by default. He'd inherited Schultz's operations. But they were bleeding money. Harlem residents still boycotted, still sabotaged, still refused to cooperate, because to them it was still white gangsters stealing from the black community. Still occupation, still exploitation. Luciano could have sent more men, could have used more violence, could have tried to crush resistance the way Schultz had. But Luciano was smarter than that. He understood that occupying hostile territory is expensive, that forcing compliance costs more than gaining cooperation, that the most profitable criminal operations are the ones where the community tolerates you, or better yet, supports you. And Harlem would never support white gangsters running the numbers, but they might support a black gangster, especially one they already respected, one who'd fought for them, one who was Harlem, Bumpy Johnson. The meeting was arranged through intermediaries. Luciano didn't just call Bumpy to a sit-down. Too risky. Too much history. Schultz had been trying to kill Bumpy for 3 years. The war was too recent. The blood too fresh. So Luciano sent word through people Bumpy trusted. Harlem people who'd worked with the mob. People who could vouch that this wasn't a trap, that Luciano genuinely wanted to talk. Wanted to make a deal. The message was simple. Meet me. No violence. No threats. Just conversation about the future. About Harlem. About partnership. Bumpy was skeptical. Why wouldn't he be? Luciano was the most powerful mobster in New York, could have him killed with a phone call. Could have Harlem flooded with soldiers. Could take whatever he wanted. Why negotiate? What did Luciano need from him that he couldn't just take? But Bumpy was also curious. And practical. The war with Schultz had proven something. Harlem could resist. Could fight. Could make white takeover expensive. But it couldn't win permanently. Couldn't hold out forever. Because the mob had infinite resources. Had political connections. Had judges and cops and politicians on payroll. Had infrastructure that Harlem's independent operators couldn't match. Fighting forever meant dying eventually. But maybe, just maybe, there was another option. Maybe the system could be worked from the inside. Maybe partnership was survival. Maybe compromise was victory. So Bumpy agreed to meet. In January 1936, in a restaurant in Little Italy, neutral ground, sort of. It was Luciano's territory, but at least it wasn't a trap. At least it was public. At least Bumpy could walk in, knowing he'd probably walk out. The restaurant was closed for a private party. Just Luciano and a few of his people. Meyer Lansky was there, Frank Costello, the Commission's brain trust, and Bumpy Johnson, 31 years old, walking into a room with the most powerful gangsters in America. He came alone. No backup, no weapons, just himself. Because bringing soldiers to this meeting would have been an insult. Would have suggested he didn't trust Luciano's word. And in the mob, your word was everything. Luciano stood when Bumpy entered, shook his hand, offered him a seat, offered him food, wine, treated him like an equal, not like a subordinate. Not like someone being granted an audience, like a peer. It was deliberate, calculated. Luciano was sending a message before words were even spoken. You're not here to bow. You're here to negotiate. They ate first, made small talk, discussed safe topics, the weather, sports, nothing important. Because in mob culture, business comes after comfort. After establishing that you're civilized people who can share a meal. After creating the social framework that makes negotiation possible, only after the plates were cleared did Luciano get to the point. Dutch was an idiot, Luciano said. Simple, direct. Thought he could take Harlem by force. Didn't understand that you can't occupy a community that hates you. Can't make money in a place where everyone's working against you. Bumpy didn't respond. Just listened. Waited. He cost me money, Luciano continued. Cost me men. Cost me reputation. And for what? To prove he could beat up a black neighborhood? To show everyone how tough he was? Stupid. Wasteful. Bad business. Luciano leaned back, lit a cigarette. I don't care about race, he said. And Bumpy almost laughed. Because of course Luciano cared about race. Everyone cared about race. It determined everything in America. But Luciano qualified it. I don't care about race when it comes to business. I care about money. I care about efficiency. I care about who can deliver. And you, my friend, can deliver. He laid out the situation. Harlem's numbers racket was valuable. Potentially worth millions annually. But only if it ran smoothly. Only if the community participated. Only if costs were controlled. Only if it was managed by someone Harlem trusted. I can't run Harlem, Luciano said. My people can't run Harlem. We're white. Harlem is black. They hate us. They'll never cooperate. They'll fight us forever. And fighting forever is expensive. But you, Luciano pointed at Bumpy, you can run Harlem. You're from Harlem. You fought for Harlem. The people respect you, trust you. They'll work with you. They'll play your numbers. They'll make us all rich. Bumpy finally spoke. Why would I work for you? Luciano smiled. You wouldn't. You'd work with me partnership, not employment. He laid out the terms. Bumpy would control Harlem's numbers operation, would manage it completely, would hire his own people, would run it his way. The commission would provide protection, political connections, access to judges and cops, muscle if needed. Infrastructure. Bumpy would pay the commission a percentage, not all the profits. A percentage. The rest he kept. You'd be rich, Luciano said. Really rich. Protected. Connected. Part of the organization. Not under us. With us. It was an extraordinary offer. Unprecedented. No black gangster had ever been offered partnership with the Italian mob before. Employment? Yes, working for them, running street-level operations? Absolutely. But partnership? Equal footing? A seat at the table? Never. Bumpy asked the obvious question. What's the percentage? Luciano named a number. Bumpy countered. They negotiated. Back and forth. Like businessmen. Like equals. And eventually they reached an agreement Bumpy would control Harlem's numbers. Would pay 40% to the commission. Keep 60%. Would have autonomy in Harlem. Would attend certain commission meetings when Harlem business was discussed. Would be, for the first time in American mob history, a black gangster with real institutional power. But there were conditions. Unspoken, but understood. Bumpy couldn't go independent. Couldn't try to break away. Couldn't build his own organization separate from the commission he was in. And once you're in the mob, you don't get out. You're in until you die, or go to prison. That was the trade. Power and wealth and protection. In exchange for loyalty and obedience and permanent connection to an organization that would own him as much as he owned Harlem. Bumpy sat there, thinking this was everything he'd fought against. St. Clair had fought to keep Harlem independent, to keep black people in control of their own economics, to resist white takeover. And here he was, about to become part of that takeover, to legitimize it, to become the black face on white exploitation. It was betrayal, compromise, surrender. Everything he'd spent 3 years fighting against. But it was also survival, power, the ability to protect Harlem in ways he never could as an independent operator, access to resources that would let him build something lasting. And the cold truth was that St. Clair's vision, beautiful as it was, had failed. She was in prison. Holstein was broken. The other independent operators had folded black independence in Harlem's underworld was already dead. The question wasn't whether the mob would control Harlem. They already did. The question was whether a black gangster would share that control, or whether white gangsters would run everything Bumpy made his decision. He shook Luciano's hand. The deal was made. The partnership was formed, and everything changed. When Stephanie St. Clair got out of prison in 1938, after serving 5 years, Harlem was different. Not dramatically. The streets looked the same. The buildings. The people. But the power structure had shifted. Dutch Schultz was dead. The independent black numbers bankers were mostly gone, and Bumpy Johnson, her former enforcer, was running Harlem's numbers in partnership with Lucky Luciano's organization. She was furious, felt betrayed. Had spent 5 years in prison fighting, refusing to surrender, maintaining her dignity and defiance. And she came home to find that the war she'd fought had been lost anyway. That her protege had made a deal with the very people she'd gone to prison resisting. She confronted Bumpy. The conversation was private, but people heard about it. Heard her rage, heard her accusations. Traitor, sellout, Uncle Tom. Everything she'd fought for, he'd surrendered. Everything she'd built, he'd handed to white gangsters. Bumpy let her vent, didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself immediately. Just let her say what she needed to say. And when she was done, he explained calmly, pragmatically, the war was unwinnable. Schultz was just the beginning. The mob would have kept coming, would have sent someone else and someone else, until Harlem was crushed or absorbed. Fighting forever wasn't bravery. It was suicide. You're right, Bumpy told her. I compromised, I made a deal. I'm working with the people we fought, but I'm alive, and I have power, and I can protect Harlem in ways we never could before. St. Clair didn't accept it couldn't. Her entire identity was built on resistance, on refusing to bow, on fighting until death rather than surrendering. Bumpy's pragmatism felt like weakness, like moral failure, like everything she despised. She tried to restart her operation, tried to rebuild, but it was different now. The landscape had changed. The commission controlled the numbers, Bumpy controlled the streets. There was no room for independent operators anymore. No space for the kind of autonomy she'd once had. She operated on the margins, small time. Nothing like the empire she'd built in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it ate at her. Not the lack of money. She had savings, had invested well, could live comfortably, but the lack of power, the lack of independence, the fact that Harlem's underworld was now integrated into the white mob structure. That black gangsters were partners? Yes, but junior partners. That the dream of black economic independence had died. She'd see Bumpy around Harlem walking the streets, dressed well, respected, protected, powerful, and she'd feel the anger rise, because he'd won by surrendering, had gained power by compromising, had become important by accepting limits she'd never accept. But here's the complexity, the nuance that history often misses. Bumpy's compromise wasn't simple betrayal. It was strategic survival. Because working with the commission gave him leverage he'd never had before, access to political protection, to judges who'd dismiss charges, to cops who'd look the other way, to lawyers who could get him out of jail, to resources that made his operation more efficient and more profitable. And critically, it gave him the ability to keep other predators out of Harlem, because now Bumpy had the commission's backing, had institutional power, had the ability to say no to other gangsters and make it stick. When white criminals from downtown tried to move into Harlem, tried to start their own operations, tried to exploit the community, Bumpy could shut them down, with violence if necessary, with political connections if possible, but shut them down either way. So yes, he was working with the mob, but he was also protecting Harlem from worse exploitation. From the kind of chaos that would have consumed the neighborhood if there had been no order at all. The numbers racket under Bumpy's control was different from Schultz's brief reign. Bumpy kept it mostly black, hired Harlem residents, paid them well, didn't allow his runners to cheat, paid winners immediately, maintained the trust that made the operation profitable. He lived in Harlem, spent money in Harlem, supported local businesses, helped families in trouble, kept the community safer than it would have been otherwise. Was he a gangster? Absolutely. Was he making money from illegal gambling? Yes. Was he working with white mobsters who wouldn't have given him the time of day if he wasn't profitable? Of course. But was he also, in his own way, protecting Harlem? Also yes. It's complicated. History is complicated. People are complicated. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal who helped his community, a gangster who fought racism within the mob, a man who compromised to gain power and used that power to do both good and evil. Reducing him to hero or villain misses the point entirely. By 1940, the structure was set. The Commission controlled organized crime in New York. Bumpy controlled Harlem's numbers as a commission-approved operator. He paid his percentage, attended meetings when required, followed the rules, and in exchange, he was protected, wealthy, powerful, untouchable in ways that independent operators could never be. Other black gangsters saw what he'd achieved, saw that partnership with the mob was possible, that black criminals could have real power if they played the game smart and they started making their own deals. In Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in other black neighborhoods across New York. The model spread. Black gangsters as partners, not employees, not equal partners. The Commission always kept the real power, but partners nonetheless, with autonomy, with profits, with protection. Lucky Luciano, meanwhile, was cementing his legend. By 1936, he controlled the largest heroin importation network in America, was making millions from prostitution, from gambling, from union rackets, was arguably the most powerful gangster in American history. But in 1936, he made a mistake. Got sloppy. Or more accurately, the prosecutor Thomas Dewey, the same one Schultz had wanted to kill, was too good. Dewey built a case against Luciano prostitution charges, compulsory prostitution, running a prostitution ring. The trial was in 1936. The evidence was strong, the witnesses credible, the verdict guilty. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The boss of bosses was going to jail. It should have destroyed the Commission, should have created a power vacuum, should have led to war as different factions fought for control. But it didn't, because Luciano had built an organization that could function without him, had created systems, not personality-based power. Frank Costello took over day-to-day operations. Meyer Lansky handled financial matters. Vito Genovese managed enforcement. The machine kept running, the profits kept flowing, and Bumpy's arrangement stayed in place. Even from prison, Luciano remained influential, could send messages, could make decisions, could guide policy, and one of his consistent policies was maintaining the partnership with Bumpy Johnson. Because it was working, Harlem's numbers were profitable. The community was stable. The arrangement was generating steady income with minimal problems. Why change it? So through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Bumpy consolidated his power, expanded his operations, started moving into other rackets, heroin, protection, loan sharking, always with commission approval, always paying his percentage, always playing by the rules, but building an empire nonetheless, a black empire in Harlem, limited by white oversight, but real nonetheless. World War II changed things, changed everything, really. Millions of men went to fight, including black men from Harlem, and when they came back different. They'd fought for America, had bled for America, had proven their courage and their loyalty, and they came home to the same racism, the same discrimination, the same limitations. But they were less willing to accept it, less willing to bow, less willing to stay in their place. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted in those years, in the disconnect between the heroism black soldiers showed in Europe and the disrespect they received at home. And that energy, that refusal to accept second-class citizenship, affected everything, including crime. Black gangsters in the 1940s were different from the previous generation. More confident, more ambitious, more willing to challenge the mob's hierarchy, more interested in building their own power bases. And Bumpy Johnson became their model. Their proof that black gangsters could succeed at the highest levels. He started mentoring young criminals, teaching them not just violence, strategy, organization, how to build operations that lasted, how to work with the mob without being consumed by it, how to maintain independence within partnership, how to be smart, not just tough. One of his proteges was a young man named Frank Lucas. Born in North Carolina, came to Harlem as a teenager. Started in street crime, small-time robberies, nothing special, until Bumpy noticed him, saw potential, took him under his wing, started teaching him the game. Frank Lucas would later become one of the most famous drug dealers in American history, would claim to have made hundreds of millions, would inspire movies and books, and he'd always credit Bumpy Johnson. Would say that everything he learned, every strategy he used, every success he achieved, came from watching Bumpy. From learning how Bumpy navigated the mob, how Bumpy maintained power, how Bumpy survived. By 1950, Bumpy Johnson was an institution, had been running Harlem's underworld for 15 years, had survived wars, betrayals, arrests, violence, had built relationships with the most powerful mobsters in America, was respected in both the criminal world and, strangely, in parts of the legitimate Harlem community, because he helped people, paid for funerals when families couldn't afford them, sent kids to college, kept drug dealers away from schools, protected the neighborhood from worse predators. He was complicated, a criminal who did good things, a violent man who maintained order, a gangster who was also, in his way, a community leader. Stephanie St. Clair watched all of this from the margins. She'd never reconciled with Bumpy, never accepted his compromise, but she couldn't deny that he'd succeeded, that he'd built something lasting, that he'd achieved power she never had. And maybe, in her quieter moments, she wondered if she'd been wrong, if resistance without compromise was noble but futile, if Bumpy's pragmatism was actually wisdom, not weakness. She died in 1969. Stephanie St. Clair, Queenie, Madame St. Clair, the woman who went to war with Dutch Schultz and refused to surrender, who spent years in prison rather than bow, who embodied black resistance in its purest, most uncompromising form. She died relatively unknown outside Harlem. No obituaries in major newspapers. No recognition from the legitimate world. Just a footnote in criminal history. But in Harlem, they remembered the queen who wouldn't bend, who fought when fighting was suicide, who proved that black women could be as dangerous, as powerful, as unbreakable as anyone. Her funeral was small, but Bumpy Johnson came, paid his respects, said goodbye to the woman who'd given him his start, who'd taught him, even if she didn't mean to, that sometimes resistance isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself, about maintaining dignity when the system demands surrender, about fighting even when fighting is futile, because the fight itself matters. Bumpy would die the next year, 1968, heart attack, died in Harlem, in the neighborhood he'd protected and exploited for nearly 4 decades. And when he died, the era died with him, the era of the partnership, of black gangsters working with the Italian mob, because the next generation had different ideas, different ambitions, different strategies. They'd watched Bumpy work with the mob, watched him pay his percentage, watched him ask permission, watched him operate within limits set by white gangsters, and they decided to do it differently, to go independent, to build their own organizations, to refuse partnership entirely. Frank Lucas, Nicky Barnes, Leroy, Nicky Barnes, the next generation of Harlem gangsters. and they would take everything Bumpy taught them and use it to break free of the very system he'd helped build. Frank Lucas was born in LaGrange, North Carolina in 1930. Came from nothing, worse than nothing. Poverty so deep it felt like drowning. His family were sharecroppers. Essentially, still enslaved, just without the legal designation. The South in the 1930s and 1940s for black families was hell with a different name. Lucas watched the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin, watched them lynch a man for the crime of looking at a white woman, watched the system grind black people into dust and call it civilization. He learned early that the rules were rigged, that playing by those rules meant losing, that survival required breaking them. He came to Harlem in 1946, 16 years old, no money, no connections, no plan except to escape the South and maybe, just maybe, build something better. He started with petty crime, stealing, robbing, small-time hustles that barely kept him fed. He was good at it. Natural. Had the kind of intelligence that doesn't come from school, but from surviving when survival requires you to think fast or die. But he was also smart enough to know that street crime had a ceiling. You could rob your whole life and never be more than a street criminal. One arrest away from prison. One mistake away from death. One stupid move away from nothing. In 1952, Frank Lucas met Bumpy Johnson. The meeting was accidental. Frank was working as a driver for a local hustler, picked up Bumpy from a club one night, and Bumpy, who had an eye for talent, who'd been mentoring young criminals for years, saw something in Frank, saw the intelligence, the ambition, the hunger, saw himself 20 years earlier. He started talking to Frank, asking questions, testing him, and Frank impressed him. Not with strength, Frank was tough, but not physically imposing, with his mind, with his ability to think strategically, to see angles, to understand that crime was business, and business was about systems, not individual scores. Bumpy took Frank under his wing. Not formally. He didn't announce it, didn't make a big deal. Just started bringing Frank around. Started including him in conversations, started teaching him. And Frank absorbed everything. Watched how Bumpy moved through Harlem, how he talked to people, how he commanded respect without violence, how he navigated the mob's hierarchy, how he made money while keeping the community on his side, how he survived in a world designed to kill people like them. But Frank also watched the limitations. Watched Bumpy pay his percentage to the Italian mob. Watched him ask permission for major moves. Watched him operate within constraints set by white gangsters. Watched him be powerful, but not free. And Frank started thinking, started planning, started asking himself the question that would define his entire career. Why? Why did black gangsters have to work for the mob? Why did they have to pay tribute? Why couldn't they build their own organizations? Independent ones. Ones that didn't answer to anyone. Bumpy would tell him it was impossible. That the mob controlled the infrastructure, the political connections, the supply chains. That going independent meant war, meant death. That partnership was the only viable option. But Frank wasn't convinced. Thought maybe Bumpy's generation had done the best they could with what they had. But that a new generation, with new strategies, with new connections, could do better, could actually break free. The key, Frank realized, was heroin. By the 1960s, heroin was the most profitable drug in America, more valuable than gambling, more profitable than any other racket. The Italian mob controlled the heroin trade in New York, imported it from Europe, distributed it through their network, made fortunes, and black gangsters, including Bumpy, were allowed to sell it, but only as distributors. Only as street-level dealers. The real money, the importation, and wholesale that was white-controlled. Frank saw the inefficiency, saw the markups, saw how much money was being lost to middlemen. And he had an idea, a crazy idea, an idea that Bumpy told him was impossible. What if you cut out the Italian mob entirely? What if you imported heroin directly? What if you built your own supply chain? The Italian mob imported heroin from France, the famous French connection. Turkish opium refined in Marseille, smuggled into New York, distributed through mob-controlled networks. But Frank had been paying attention to the news, to Vietnam, to the war that was consuming American resources and American lives, and he knew something the mob didn't. That Southeast Asia, particularly the Golden Triangle region, where Burma, Thailand, and Laos met, was producing the highest quality heroin in the world, and that American military flights were going in and out of that region constantly, every day, carrying supplies, carrying soldiers, carrying cargo. And nobody was checking military flights very carefully, because they were American military, trusted, above suspicion. Frank went to Southeast Asia in 1968, right after Bumpy died, used his savings, went to Thailand, to the Golden Triangle, met with Chinese Thai heroin producers who'd been supplying the region for decades, and he made them an offer. He'd buy directly from them, cut out all the middlemen, pay cash, take large quantities, guarantee regular purchases, and in exchange, they'd give him the best heroin at the lowest price. The producers were skeptical. Who was this black American? What organization did he represent? How could he guarantee anything? Frank didn't represent an organization. He was the organization. Just him. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the advantage. No mob bureaucracy. No commission approval needed. No splitting profits with white gangsters. Just direct purchase. Direct importation. Direct control. He made the deal. Bought his first shipment. 100 kilograms of pure heroin. 100% pure. Not the 10% or 20% pure stuff being sold on American streets pure. Which meant he could cut it, dilute it, and still have a product stronger than anything else on the market. He called it Blue Magic. His brand. His product. His empire. The problem was getting it to America. Shipping it commercially was too risky. Too many inspections. Too many opportunities for seizure. Too many people involved who could talk. But Frank had been thinking about this. Had made connections in Vietnam. Had befriended soldiers. Had paid people. Had arranged something audacious. Something the Italian mob would never think of. Something so bold it seemed impossible. He smuggled the heroin in the coffins of dead American soldiers. Think about that for a moment. The bodies of American servicemen killed in Vietnam were being flown back to the United States for burial. In flag-draped coffins with full military honors. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was inspecting those coffins. Because inspecting them would be disrespectful, would be unpatriotic, would be questioning the military's integrity. So the coffins came through customs without inspection, without searches, without any scrutiny at all, and hidden inside some of those coffins, beneath the bodies, wrapped carefully so as not to be detected, were kilograms of pure heroin. Frank Lucas was using America's war dead to smuggle drugs. It was horrifying. It was brilliant. It was the kind of move that showed exactly how far he was willing to go. How completely he'd rejected conventional morality. How totally he'd embraced the criminal mindset. The heroin arrived in New York. Frank cut it, packaged it, branded it as Blue Magic, and put it on the street. The response was immediate. Blue Magic was stronger than anything else available. Got users higher. Lasted longer. Cost less because Frank had eliminated the middlemen. Within months, Blue Magic was the most sought-after heroin in New York. Users were asking for it by name. Dealers were scrambling to get it. And Frank was making money at a rate that shocked even him. He'd been right. The direct importation model worked. Cut out the mob. Cut out the middlemen. Control the entire supply chain. Keep all the profits. By 1970, Frank Lucas was grossing millions of dollars a month. Not total. Profit. He was bringing in so much cash he had trouble laundering it. Had to buy properties, businesses, anything to hide the money. He bought apartment buildings in Harlem. Bought legitimate businesses as fronts bought cars, jewelry, fur coats, a mansion in New Jersey. He lived large, visibly, ostentatiously. This wasn't Bumpy's controlled elegance. This was wealth as performance, as proof, as middle finger to everyone who said black people couldn't build empires. And he employed hundreds of people. Relatives from North Carolina, Harlem residents, built an organization that was almost entirely black, almost entirely loyal to him, almost entirely independent of white oversight. The Italian mob noticed. Of course they noticed. Noticed that heroin in Harlem was flowing through channels they didn't control. Noticed that a black gangster was operating independently. Noticed that Frank Lucas was breaking the rules. The same rules Bumpy had followed his entire life. The rules that said black gangsters worked with the mob, or they didn't work at all. They reached out, sent messages, demanded meetings, told Frank he needed to pay tribute, needed to get commission approval, needed to follow the structure Frank refused. Not diplomatically, not carefully, just flat out refused. Said he didn't work for them, didn't need them, didn't owe them anything. Said he was independent, built his own organization, answered to nobody. It should have gotten him killed, would have gotten anyone else killed. But Frank had done something smart, something Bumpy had taught him. He'd built relationships with law enforcement, not to avoid arrest, to avoid mob retaliation. He'd made it clear to the Italian mob that if they moved against him, if they tried to kill him or shut him down, he'd cooperate with the feds, would expose mob operations, would testify, would bring down indictments on everyone. It was mutually assured destruction. The mob could kill him, but it would cost them everything. So they didn't. They watched. They fumed. They complained. But they didn't move. Because Frank had made himself too dangerous to kill. And other black gangsters watched. Watched Frank Lucas operate independently. Watched him make millions without mob permission. Watched him break the rules and survive. And they realized something revolutionary. The system wasn't inevitable. The mob's control wasn't permanent. Black gangsters could go independent, could build their own empires, could refuse partnership, could actually win. Frank Lucas proved it was possible. Not easy, not safe, but possible. And that possibility changed everything. Because once people know something is possible, they start trying, start building, start refusing to accept limitations. One of those people was watching very carefully. A young gangster named Leroy Nicky Barnes. He'd worked the streets, had done time, had sold heroin for various organizations, and he'd watched Frank Lucas with a mixture of admiration and calculation. Admired the independence, the audacity, the success, but also saw the flaws, the vulnerabilities, the mistakes, and he thought to himself, I can do this better, smarter, more sustainably. And in the early 1970s, Nicky Barnes started building exactly that. Leroy Nicky Barnes was born in Harlem in 1933. Grew up in the projects, public housing that was supposed to be progress, but felt like warehouses for poor people. He watched his mother struggle, watched poverty grind her down, watched the legitimate economy offer black people nothing but servitude and scraps. And he made the decision early. He wasn't going to be poor, wasn't going to struggle, wasn't going to accept what society said he could and couldn't have. He was going to take it, by any means necessary. He started dealing heroin in the 1950s. Small time, street level, working for other people, learning the business, learning the streets, getting arrested, doing time, coming out harder, more committed, more strategic. He did a serious bid in the early 1960s. Federal prison, 5 years. And he used that time like graduate school, met other criminals, connected with mob figures, learned organization, learned structure, learned how the big operations worked. Came out in 1967 with a plan. He wouldn't just deal drugs, he'd build an empire, a real one, with infrastructure, with hierarchy, with systems that could survive law enforcement pressure. But Barnes watched Frank Lucas's operation with a critical eye, identified the weaknesses. Frank was brilliant about supply. The direct importation from Southeast Asia was genius, cut out the mob. Maximize profits? Perfect. But Frank's organization was flawed, family-based, his brothers, his cousins. People from North Carolina loyal, yes, but not professional, not disciplined, not organized in a way that could scale or survive serious pressure. And Frank's lifestyle was suicidal. The furs, the cars, the mansion, the visible wealth, it attracted attention, made him a target, made law enforcement focus on him. Barnes thought he could do better, could build something more sophisticated, more professional, more sustainable, and more importantly, something that didn't depend on one man. In 1972, Barnes created the Council, 7 black drug dealers from Harlem. Each one controlled their own territory, their own organization, their own operations. But they coordinated, shared suppliers, shared intelligence, supported each other, operated as a collective. It was revolutionary. The council wasn't a hierarchy with Barnes at the top, though he was the most influential member. It was a cooperative, a board of directors for heroin distribution. Each member was independent but connected, could operate autonomously but had backup, had support, had organizational strength that individual dealers couldn't match. The council members were smart, disciplined, professional. They didn't flash wealth like Frank Lucas. They lived well but quietly, invested money in legitimate businesses, bought real estate, laundered profits through legal channels, built infrastructure that looked legitimate to outside observers. They were criminals running their operations like corporations, with accounting, with planning, with long-term strategies. And they went completely independent, didn't work with the Italian mob, didn't ask permission, didn't pay tribute, built their own supply chains, their own distribution networks, their own everything. By 1972, Harlem had something it had never had before. 2 massive, independent black drug empires operating simultaneously. Frank Lucas with his Blue Magic heroin imported directly from Southeast Asia. Nicky Barnes with the Council, 7 coordinated drug operations functioning as a criminal corporation. Both men were making millions. Both had broken free from the Italian mob. Both had achieved what Bumpy Johnson had only approached. True independence, real power, actual autonomy. They should have been allies, should have recognized that they were fighting the same fight, proving the same point, demonstrating that black gangsters could operate at the highest levels without white oversight, should have protected each other, supported each other, built something together that was bigger than either of them individually. But they hated each other. Not at first. Initially, there was mutual respect. Frank Lucas had been Bumpy's protege, had learned from the master, had revolutionary supply chain strategies. Nicky Barnes recognized that, respected the hustle, admired the audacity of smuggling heroin in military coffins, saw Lucas as a fellow pioneer, someone else who understood that the old rules were dead, that black gangsters didn't need the mob anymore. And Lucas initially respected Barnes too, saw the council as brilliant, saw the cooperative model as sophisticated, saw Barnes as someone who understood organization in ways most street dealers never would. For a brief moment in 1971 and early 1972, it seemed like they might actually work together, might coordinate, might divide Harlem between them and operate in harmony. There were preliminary conversations, indirect messages through mutual associates, discussions about cooperation, about how 2 independent black operations could support each other, about presenting a united front against any attempt by the Italian mob to reassert control. It could have worked, should have worked, would have made both men safer, richer, more powerful. But ego got in the way, because both men wanted the same thing. Not just money, not just power. Legacy, recognition. They wanted to be known as the gangster who freed black criminals from white control. The visionary who revolutionized the game. The legend. And there's no room for 2 legends occupying the same space. No room for shared credit. No room for equal recognition. One of them had to be first. Had to be greatest. Had to be the one people remembered. And neither was willing to be second. The tension started small, subtle. Comments made to mutual associates. Frank saying the council was just a committee of mid-level dealers pretending to be sophisticated Barnes, saying Lucas was a country boy from Carolina who got lucky with a military connection but didn't understand real organization. Petty stuff, meaningless in the grand scheme. But it revealed something deeper. A fundamental incompatibility. A clash not just of egos, but of philosophies, of approaches, of visions for what black organized crime should look like. Frank Lucas believed in the independent operator model. One brilliant individual at the top, family and trusted associates below. Loyalty based on blood and personal relationships. Decisions made quickly by one person. Efficiency through centralized control. It was how the Italian mob worked. How most successful criminal organizations worked one boss. One vision. One ultimate authority. And Frank saw himself as that authority. As the natural leader. As the genius whose innovations deserved sole credit, Nicky Barnes believed in the cooperative model. Multiple leaders coordinating, decisions made collectively, power distributed to prevent vulnerability. No single point of failure. It was revolutionary, was more sustainable, was less dependent on any individual's survival, and Barnes saw it as superior, as more evolved, as proof that black criminals could innovate beyond what white gangsters had imagined. Two different philosophies, two different visions, two different paths to the same goal. And both men were absolutely convinced theirs was the right one, the only one, the superior one. The arguments escalated. What started as subtle digs became open criticism. Frank started telling people that the council was inefficient, that decisions by committee were slow, that real gangsters didn't need 6 partners to make moves. Barnes started saying that family-based organizations were vulnerable, that Lucas's brothers were liabilities, that nepotism was weakness disguised as loyalty. Neither man would back down. Neither would concede that the other's approach had merit. Neither would acknowledge that both models could coexist, could even complement each other. And as the criticism became more public, more pointed, more personal, reconciliation became impossible. You can't work with someone you've publicly disrespected. Can't cooperate with someone you've called weak. Can't share territory with someone you've declared inferior. The bridge burned before either man realized they were standing on it. The competition became visible in 1973. Both organizations were selling heroin in Harlem. Same territory, same customer base, same market, and they started undercutting each other. Frank would drop his prices. Nicky would drop lower. Frank would increase purity. Nicky would match it back and forth, a price war that benefited only the addicts, who suddenly had access to cheaper, stronger heroin than ever before, and hurt both organizations' profit margins. This was stupid, irrational, bad business. Both men knew it, but neither would stop, because stopping meant admitting the other guy had won, meant backing down, meant accepting a subordinate position, and their egos wouldn't allow it. The territorial disputes started small. Frank's dealers would set up on a corner. Barnes's dealers would move in. Arguments, shoving. Eventually, violent street-level soldiers from both organizations fighting over corners, over buildings, over customers. Lucas and Barnes weren't ordering these conflicts, weren't strategically planning territory wars, but they weren't stopping them either, because controlling more territory meant winning. Meant being more successful, meant proving your operation was superior. The soldiers picked up on the tension between their bosses, understood that Lucas and Barnes hated each other, and they acted accordingly, defended their territory more aggressively, pushed into rival territory more boldly, escalated conflicts more readily, because they thought that's what their bosses wanted. And they weren't entirely wrong. By 1974, the rivalry had become personal. Frank Lucas gave an interview to a magazine, didn't name Barnes, but made it clear who he was talking about. Said that real gangsters work alone, that committees are for people who can't make decisions, that the council was 7 guys too scared to operate independently, pretending that cooperation was sophistication. It was insulting, was meant to be insulting. And Barnes responded, Not publicly at first, but through the street, through messages delivered by intermediaries. Told Lucas that country boys who got lucky shouldn't mistake luck for genius. That importing heroin wasn't revolutionary, it was obvious. That anyone with military connections could have done it. That the council's organizational model was the actual innovation, the actual genius, the actual future. The disrespect escalated. Lucas started throwing parties, massive, ostentatious parties in New Jersey, inviting celebrities, showing off his wealth, his furs, his cars, his mansion, making sure everyone knew he was the richest gangster in Harlem, making sure the message reached Barnes. This wasn't about enjoying wealth. This was about demonstrating superiority, about showing who was winning. Barnes responded by being more visible in Harlem itself, by walking the streets, by being seen, by making sure everyone knew he lived in Harlem, not some mansion in New Jersey, by positioning himself as the real Harlem gangster, while Lucas was an outsider, a transplant, someone who made his money in Harlem but didn't really belong there. Both strategies worked on their intended audiences. Lucas impressed people who valued wealth and flash. Barnes impressed people who valued authenticity and community connection. And both men convinced themselves they were winning, that the other guy was losing, that their approach was being validated. The community watched this with confusion and concern. Here were two black gangsters who'd achieved independence from white control, who'd built massive empires, who'd proven black capability. And instead of working together, instead of protecting what they'd built, they were destroying each other. Over what? Ego, recognition, the need to be the guy instead of a guy. But the competition was making them both vulnerable, both more visible than they needed to be, both more exposed than was safe, both doing things that drew law enforcement attention for no reason except Ego Lucas's parties, his lifestyle, his magazine interviews. They were making him a target, making law enforcement notice him, making prosecutors interested Barnes's visibility in Harlem, his growing reputation, his increasingly public presence. Same thing. Drawing attention, making enemies, creating vulnerability. A smart gangster stays invisible, makes money quietly, avoids attention, operates below the radar. Both Lucas and Barnes knew this. Both had learned it from Bumpy, but they couldn't help themselves, couldn't stop competing, couldn't resist the urge to prove they were better than the other guy, even when proving it meant destroying themselves. And there was violence, not between Lucas and Barnes directly. They never met for a showdown, never had a dramatic confrontation, but their organizations clashed. Lucas's people killed some of Barnes's dealers. Barnes's people killed some of Lucas's family members. Not many. Not a war in the traditional sense, but enough. Enough blood. Enough death. Enough escalation that both organizations were damaged. That both men lost people they cared about. That both sides wanted revenge. The Italian mob watched this with a mixture of amusement and concern. Amusement because two black gangsters were destroying each other without mob involvement. Concern because the violence was drawing federal attention, was making Harlem hot, was threatening to bring investigations that could hurt everyone. They sent messages to both Lucas and Barnes, told them to calm down, told them the fighting was bad for business, told them that if they couldn't control their people, the mob would intervene. Both men ignored the warnings, because accepting mob mediation meant acknowledging the mob still had authority, still had power over black gangsters, still could tell them what to do. And both Lucas and Barnes had fought too hard for independence to accept that. So they kept fighting, kept competing, kept making each other vulnerable, kept proving that sometimes the worst enemy isn't the system. It's the person fighting beside you who wants the same thing you want. The same recognition, the same legacy, the same place in history. The breaking point came in 1975. Frank Lucas's wife was arrested, not on major charges. Minor possession, something that should have been handled with a lawyer and a fine. But the arrest gave law enforcement leverage, gave them access to Lucas's family, gave them information they'd been trying to get for years. And Lucas panicked, started making mistakes, started being sloppy, started acting like a man who knew the walls were closing in. Barnes saw an opportunity. Started spreading rumors, started telling people that Lucas was cooperating, that he was talking to the feds, that he was getting ready to flip. None of it was true. Not yet. But Barnes wanted to damage Lucas's reputation, wanted to make people distrust him, wanted to isolate him. It was a smart move, a strategic move, the kind of move that proves Barnes understood psychological warfare. But it was also the move that sealed both their fates. Because Lucas heard the rumors, heard that Barnes was saying he was a snitch, and he became obsessed with proving it wasn't true, with demonstrating his loyalty, his toughness, his refusal to cooperate. He started being more visible, more aggressive, more reckless, exactly the opposite of what he should have been doing while under investigation. He started openly discussing his organization, explaining how the heroin importation worked, telling people about his Southeast Asia connections, essentially confessing to federal crimes in an effort to prove he wasn't afraid, that he wasn't going to cooperate, that he was still the toughest gangster in Harlem. The DEA was listening, recording, building their case. Every word Lucas said to defend himself against Barnes's accusations was another piece of evidence, another count in the indictment, another nail in his coffin. And Barnes wasn't doing any better. His ego had gotten completely out of control. He agreed to that New York Times magazine cover. Mr. Untouchable. Put his face on national television. Did interviews where he essentially admitted to being a drug dealer while claiming he couldn't be prosecuted. It was insane. Was suicidal. Was exactly what prosecutors needed to make him a priority, to make destroying him a personal mission, to dedicate unlimited resources to bringing him down. President Jimmy Carter saw that magazine cover. Actually saw it. And he called the Attorney General. Told him to make prosecuting Nicky Barnes a priority. When the President of the United States personally wants you arrested, you're going to get arrested. No amount of organization, no amount of sophistication, no amount of claiming to be untouchable can save you from that level of attention. Both men were arrested. Lucas in 1975. Barnes in 1977. Both tried. Both convicted. Both sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. And sitting in their cells, facing the rest of their lives behind bars, both men made the same decision. They cooperated, became government witnesses, testified against their organizations, against their friends, against their families, against everyone. The two men who'd hated each other so much, who'd competed so fiercely, who'd fought so hard to prove who was superior, they ended up doing the exact same thing, the exact same betrayal, the exact same surrender. The irony was devastating. They destroyed each other fighting over who was the better gangster, and in the end, neither was. Both were cooperators. Both were snitches. Both were exactly what they'd accused each other of being. Barnes's cooperation brought down dozens of criminals, destroyed what remained of the council. Lucas's cooperation took down his own organization, his family, everyone who'd trusted him, and both men disappeared into witness protection, new identities, new lives, new everything. Barnes died in 2012, a free man living under an assumed name somewhere in America. Nobody knew. Nobody cared. The man who'd been on the cover of the New York Times, who'd been called Mr. Untouchable, who'd built an empire, died anonymously forgotten. Lucas got out eventually, died in 2019. Same story, same ending, same irrelevance. The rivalry between Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes proved something tragic. Proved that escaping white control didn't solve all the problems, didn't create automatic unity. Didn't mean black gangsters would work together for mutual benefit. They'd fought so hard to break free from the Italian mob, had risked everything to achieve independence, had proven that black criminals could operate at the highest levels without white oversight. And then they turned on each other, fought each other with the same viciousness that white gangsters had shown them, destroyed each other with the same ruthlessness. Prove that power corrupts regardless of race. That ego destroys regardless of background. That independence without cooperation is just isolation. If Lucas and Barnes had worked together, had coordinated their operations, had divided territory peacefully, had supported each other instead of competing, they might have built something lasting. Something that could have survived law enforcement pressure. Something that could have evolved, could have adapted, could have created institutional black power in the criminal underworld that persisted beyond individual arrests. But they couldn't do it. Couldn't put aside their egos. Couldn't share credit. Couldn't accept being equals. And so they destroyed each other. Handed the prosecutors everything they needed. Made themselves vulnerable through competition that benefited nobody except law enforcement. The law enforcement officials who prosecuted them understood this. Understood that the rivalry made their jobs easier, made both men more vulnerable, made both organizations weaker. One investigator said it explicitly after both convictions. We didn't beat them. They beat themselves. If they'd worked together, if they'd protected each other, if they'd been smart about their competition, we might never have touched them. But they made it easy, made themselves targets, made our cases for us. That's the legacy of the Lucas-Barnes rivalry. Not two great gangsters competing for supremacy. Two great gangsters destroying each other. Two men who achieved independence from white control only to prove they didn't know what to do with it, who broke free from the mob only to become their own worst enemies, who succeeded at everything except the most important thing, survival. And the next generation, watching from the streets, learned the wrong lesson. Didn't learn, cooperate, and you'll be stronger. Learned trust nobody, especially other black gangsters. Didn't learn unity is power. Learned everyone's competition, even people who should be allies. Didn't learn independence requires coordination. Learned independence means being alone. The crack dealers of the 1980s, the ones who would make Lucas and Barnes look small time, they learned from this rivalry. And what they learned was that black gangsters would destroy each other as readily as white gangsters would destroy them. That community meant nothing. That loyalty was weakness. That the only person you could trust was yourself. And that lesson, that toxic, destructive, self-defeating lesson, that shaped a generation, created a culture, defined an era. But we need to talk about what all of this cost. Because the story of Harlem's gangsters isn't just about power and resistance and breaking barriers. It's also about destruction, about communities devastated, about families destroyed, about a generation lost to addiction and violence and death. The numbers racket that Stephanie St. Clair and Casper Holstein ran was gambling. Exploitative? Yes. Illegal? Absolutely. But relatively harmless compared to what came later. People lost money. Sometimes money they couldn't afford to lose. But they didn't die. Didn't become addicted. Didn't destroy their lives. The heroin that Bumpy Johnson helped distribute, that Frank Lucas imported, that Nicky Barnes sold, that was different. That was poison. That was death in a bag. That was entire communities collapsing. Harlem in the 1970s was a war zone, not a metaphor, an actual war zone with casualties and trauma and death. The heroin epidemic that these gangsters fueled destroyed thousands of lives, tens of thousands. Fathers became addicts. Mothers became addicts. Kids grew up in homes where parents cared more about the next fix than about feeding their children. Crime exploded. Not organized crime. Desperate crime. Addicts robbing each other. Stealing from family. Prostituting themselves for drug money. The social fabric of Harlem, which had survived slavery, and Jim Crow and the Great Depression and racial violence, nearly collapsed under the weight of heroin addiction. And the gangsters knew. They weren't stupid. They weren't blind. They saw what their product did. Saw the addicts nodding off in doorways. Saw the children being neglected. Saw the violence. Saw the destruction. And they did it anyway, because the money was too good. Because survival in their world required putting profits above conscience. Because caring about the damage they caused would have made it impossible to continue. So they didn't care. Or they told themselves they didn't. Told themselves that if they didn't sell it, someone else would. That the addicts made their own choices. That they weren't responsible for other people's decisions. All the rationalizations that criminals use to sleep at night. Bumpy Johnson, who's often romanticized as a Robin Hood figure, who's portrayed in movies and TV shows as a community protector, distributed heroin in Harlem for decades, helped create the addiction epidemic, profited from the destruction of his own community. Yes, he also helped people, paid for funerals, sent kids to college, kept other predators out. But he was also poisoning the same community he claimed to protect. That complexity matters. That contradiction is important, because reducing him to hero misses half the story. Reducing him to villain misses the other half. He was both, simultaneously, and that's harder to process than a simple narrative, but it's the truth. Frank Lucas flooded Harlem with heroin so pure it killed people. People overdosed on blue magic because they were used to heavily cut product, and Lucas's stuff was so much stronger, they shot up their normal dose and died. And Lucas knew this, knew his product was killing people, and he kept selling it, kept importing it, kept expanding his empire, kept making millions while Harlem residents died. His direct importation model, which was brilliant from a business perspective, which revolutionized drug trafficking, also made heroin cheaper and more available, made the epidemic worse, made the death toll higher. That's not separate from his story. That is his story. Nicky Barnes and the council were even more destructive. They industrialized heroin distribution, made it efficient, made it widespread, made it impossible to avoid. By the mid-1970s, you couldn't walk through Harlem without encountering drugs. Dealers on every corner, addicts everywhere, children growing up surrounded by addiction and death and hopelessness. And the council profited, made millions, built empires. While the community that produced them, that raised them, that they claimed to represent, was dying. There's no way to reconcile this. No way to make it acceptable. No justification that holds up. They destroyed Harlem. Not alone. They had plenty of help: white drug dealers, Italian mob figures, corrupt cops, racist policies, systemic neglect. The destruction of Harlem in the 1970s had many authors, but black gangsters were among them, prominently, profitably, undeniably. And it raises impossible questions, questions without good answers. If every legitimate path to wealth was closed, if the system was designed to keep black people poor, if the only way to achieve financial success was through crime, then were these gangsters making a rational choice? Were they doing what anyone would do in their situation? Or is that an excuse that lets them off the hook for the damage they caused? If Casper Holstein used numbers profits to fund the Harlem Renaissance, to support black culture and institutions, does that justify the gambling operation? Does the good outweigh the harm? And if it does, where's the line? Can you justify heroin distribution if you use the profits to help the community? Can you destroy some lives if you improve others? Who decides? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're real moral dilemmas that Harlem residents faced, still face, because the gangsters did both things, did help and harm, did protect and destroy, did build and tear down, simultaneously, and the community had to navigate that complexity, had to accept help from people who were also hurting them, had to respect power while recognizing its cost, had to survive in a world where the heroes were also villains and the villains were also heroes. That psychological weight, that moral complexity, that impossible position, that's part of the legacy too. Part of what these gangsters left behind. The crack epidemic of the 1980s was even worse, made heroin look mild by comparison, and it was built on the foundation these earlier gangsters created: the supply chains they established, the distribution networks they built, the normalization of drug dealing they achieved. Frank Lucas and Nicky Barnes didn't sell crack. That came later, but they paved the way, proved it was possible, showed a generation of young black criminals that drug dealing could make you rich, could give you power, could let you escape poverty. And those young criminals who grew up watching Lucas and Barnes, who saw the wealth and the power and wanted it for themselves, they flooded their own communities with crack, destroyed another generation, created another epidemic, continued the cycle. And here's the tragic irony. The gangsters who fought so hard for black economic independence, who refused to work for white criminals, who built their own empires, who proved that black people could succeed at the highest levels of organized crime, they ultimately served white supremacy anyway. Because what does heroin addiction do? It destroys black communities, makes them poor, makes them violent, makes them dependent, makes them exactly what white racists always said they were: dangerous, criminal, pathological, unable to build functional communities. The gangsters thought they were fighting the system, thought they were building black power, thought they were proving black excellence, but they were actually reinforcing every racist stereotype, actually making black communities weaker, actually doing the system's work for it. That's the tragedy. That's the cost that never gets discussed in the romanticized versions of these stories. Movies about Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas focus on their charisma, their cleverness, their resistance to white authority, and all of that's real. But they skip over the devastation, the addiction, the death. The communities destroyed, the generations lost, because that's harder to stomach, harder to celebrate, harder to turn into entertainment. Stephanie St. Clair went to war to protect black economic independence. That's noble, that's admirable, that's worth celebrating. But the empire she was protecting was built on exploiting poor people's desperate hope, on taking money from families who couldn't afford to lose it, on gambling addiction. That's not noble, that's not admirable, that's predatory. And both things are true simultaneously. The Harlem Renaissance, that flowering of black culture that produced Langston Hughes and Duke Ellington and Zora Neale Hurston, was partially funded by numbers money, by criminal profits, by exploitation. Does that taint the art? Does it matter that some of the greatest black literature and music of the 20th century was made possible by criminal enterprises? Or is that just reality? Is that just the fact that in a racist system, resources come from wherever you can get them, and purity isn't an option when survival is at stake? There are no clean answers, no positions that don't create new problems, no judgments that don't immediately reveal their own inadequacy. Just complexity, just contradiction, just the impossibility of being black in America and making only good choices, because the system doesn't offer only good choices. It offers terrible ones and worse ones, and survival means picking the least terrible and living with the consequences. By 1980, the world Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson had built was unrecognizable. The Italian mob was declining. Federal RICO prosecutions were destroying the five families. The commission that had seemed invincible was crumbling, and black organized crime, which had fought so hard for independence, was fragmenting. No more councils, no more organizations, just individual dealers fighting over scraps. The crack epidemic consumed what heroin had started, destroyed what was left of Harlem's social fabric, turned neighborhoods into war zones worse than anything the 1970s had produced. The gangsters were gone. St. Clair dead, Bumpy dead, Holstein dead decades earlier, Lucas cooperating from witness protection, Barnes cooperating from witness protection. The next generation, the crack dealers of the 1980s, they had no connection to the old ways. No sense of community responsibility, however twisted, no code, no rules, just violence and money and self-destruction. They'd learned all the wrong lessons. Learned that drug dealing could make you rich. Didn't learn about organization, about strategy, about protecting the community, even while exploiting it. Just learned that selling poison was profitable. And they did it without conscience, without complexity, without anything except greed. But something had changed. Something fundamental. Something that couldn't be undone even as the specific organizations collapsed. The Italian mob never fully recovered its control over black neighborhoods, never reestablished the hierarchy that Bumpy had worked within, because a generation of black criminals had proven that white oversight wasn't necessary, that black people could run sophisticated criminal operations independently, that the mob's control was based on perception, not reality. And once that perception was broken, it couldn't be restored. Other ethnic groups saw the same thing, saw that the Italian mob's monopoly could be challenged. Latin American drug cartels started operating in the United States Asian gangs. Russian organized crime. Everyone realized that the old structure was collapsing, that the future of crime was multi-ethnic, decentralized, independent, and black gangsters had helped prove it was possible. In legitimate society, things were changing too. The civil rights movement had achieved legal victories, desegregation, voting rights, anti-discrimination laws. The barriers that had forced people like St. Clair and Holstein and Bumpy into crime were being challenged. Not eliminated, not destroyed, but challenged. Black people could go to better schools, could get better jobs, could access opportunities that previous generations couldn't imagine. The children and grandchildren of the Great Migration, the people who'd come to Harlem seeking something better, were finding it. Not in the underworld, in the legitimate world, becoming doctors, lawyers, business owners, politicians, building wealth legally, achieving power legitimately, proving that the criminal path, however successful individuals became, wasn't the only path, wasn't even the best path. And that raises the question, what if? What if Stephanie St. Clair's brilliance had been applied to legitimate business? What if Bumpy Johnson's strategic intelligence had been used for legal enterprises? What if Frank Lucas's entrepreneurial genius had built legitimate corporations instead of drug empires? What if Nicky Barnes's organizational skills had created legal businesses instead of the council? How much could they have achieved? How much could they have built? How much could they have helped their communities without destroying them? We'll never know, because the system, in their time, didn't offer those options. Didn't allow black excellence to flourish legitimately. Forced brilliance into the shadows, into crime, into paths that led to prison or death or betrayal. But by the 1980s and 1990s, those options were starting to exist. Not easily, not without barriers, not without racism and discrimination and all the obstacles that still existed, but they were possible. And that makes the gangster story both more tragic and more heroic. More tragic because they fought and died and destroyed for something that their children could achieve legally. More heroic because their fight, their resistance, their refusal to accept poverty, helped create the conditions that made legitimate success possible for the next generation. The gangsters didn't cause the civil rights movement, didn't lead it, weren't even particularly supportive of it, but they were part of the same impulse, the same refusal to accept white supremacy's limitations, the same insistence on black power and black excellence and black independence, just expressed through crime instead of protest, through organization instead of marches, through building underground economies instead of changing legal ones. Every successful black entrepreneur today stands on foundations built partially by criminals. Not because crime is good, not because we should celebrate it, but because in the absence of legal opportunities, black people built economic infrastructure however they could. And that infrastructure, those networks, those examples of black organizational capacity, they created templates, created proof, created possibilities, showed that black people could build and manage and succeed at complex enterprises. And when legal opportunities finally opened, even partially, black people already knew how to do it, already had the skills, already had the examples, already had the confidence. Some of that came from legitimate sources, from churches, from schools, from civil rights organizations. But some of it, whether we like it or not, came from watching gangsters build empires. From seeing that black people could organize, could lead, could succeed, even if the success was criminal. By 1980, the world Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson had built was unrecognizable. The Italian mob was declining. Federal RICO prosecutions were destroying the five families. The commission that had seemed invincible was crumbling, and black organized crime, which had fought so hard for independence, was fragmenting. No more councils, no more organizations, just individual dealers fighting over scraps. The crack epidemic consumed what heroin had started, destroyed what was left of Harlem's social fabric, turned neighborhoods into war zones worse than anything the 1970s had produced. The gangsters were gone. St. Clair dead, Bumpy dead, Holstein dead decades earlier, Lucas cooperating from witness protection, Barnes cooperating from witness protection. The next generation, the crack dealers of the 1980s, they had no connection to the old ways, no sense of community responsibility, however twisted, no code, no rules, just violence and money and self-destruction. They'd learned all the wrong lessons. Learned that drug dealing could make you rich, didn't learn about organization, about strategy, about protecting the community even while exploiting it. Just learned that selling poison was profitable. And they did it without conscience, without complexity, without anything except greed. But something had changed, something fundamental, something that couldn't be undone even as the specific organizations collapsed. The Italian mob never fully recovered its control over black neighborhoods, never reestablished the hierarchy that Bumpy had worked within, because a generation of black criminals had proven that white oversight wasn't necessary, that black people could run sophisticated criminal operations independently, that the mob's control was based on perception, not reality. And once that perception was broken, it couldn't be restored. Other ethnic groups saw the same thing, saw that the Italian mob's monopoly could be challenged. Latin American drug cartels started operating in the United States Asian gangs, Russian organized crime. Everyone realized that the old structure was collapsing, that the future of crime was multi-ethnic, decentralized, independent, and black gangsters had helped prove it was possible. In legitimate society, things were changing too. The civil rights movement had achieved legal victories, desegregation, voting rights, anti-discrimination laws. The barriers that had forced people like St. Clair and Holstein and Bumpy into crime were being challenged. Not eliminated, not destroyed, but challenged. Black people could go to better schools, could get better jobs, could access opportunities that previous generations couldn't imagine. The children and grandchildren of the Great Migration, the people who'd come to Harlem seeking something better, were finding it. Not in the underworld, in the legitimate world. Becoming doctors, lawyers, business owners, politicians, building wealth legally, achieving power legitimately. Proving that the criminal path, however successful individuals became, wasn't the only path, wasn't even the best path. And that raises the question, what if Stephanie St. Clair's brilliance had been applied to legitimate business? What if Bumpy Johnson's strategic intelligence had been used for legal enterprises? What if Frank Lucas's entrepreneurial genius had built legitimate corporations instead of drug empires? What if Nicky Barnes's organizational skills had created legal businesses instead of the council? How much could they have achieved? How much could they have built? How much could they have helped their communities without destroying them? We'll never know, because the system, in their time, didn't offer those options. Didn't allow black excellence to flourish legitimately. Forced brilliance into the shadows, into crime, into paths that led to prison, or death, or betrayal. But by the 1980s and 1990s, those options were starting to exist. Not easily, not without barriers, not without racism and discrimination and all the obstacles that still existed. But they were possible. And that makes the gangster story both more tragic and more heroic. More tragic because they fought, and died, and destroyed for something that their children could achieve legally. More heroic because their fight, their resistance, their refusal to accept poverty, helped create the conditions that made legitimate success possible for the next generation. The gangsters didn't cause the civil rights movement, didn't lead it, weren't even particularly supportive of it. But they were part of the same impulse, the same refusal to accept white supremacy's limitations, the same insistence on black power and black excellence and black independence, just expressed through crime instead of protest, through organization instead of marches, through building underground economies instead of changing legal ones. Every successful black entrepreneur today stands on foundations built partially by criminals. Not because crime is good, not because we should celebrate it, but because in the absence of legal opportunities, black people built economic infrastructure however they could. And that infrastructure, those networks, those examples of black organizational capacity, they created templates, created proof, created possibilities, showed that black people could build and manage and succeed at complex enterprises. And when legal opportunities finally opened, even partially, black people already knew how to do it, already had the skills, already had the examples, already had the confidence. Some of that came from legitimate sources, from churches, from schools, from civil rights organizations. But some of it, whether we like it or not, came from watching gangsters build empires, from seeing that black people could organize, could lead, could succeed, even if the success was criminal. By 1980, the world Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson had built was unrecognizable. The Italian mob was declining. Federal RICO prosecutions were destroying the five families. The commission that had seemed invincible was crumbling, and black organized crime, which had fought so hard for independence, was fragmenting. No more councils, no more organizations, just individual dealers fighting over scraps. The crack epidemic consumed what heroin had started, destroyed what was left of Harlem's social fabric, turned neighborhoods into war zones worse than anything the 1970s had produced. The gangsters were gone. St. Clair dead, Bumpy dead, Holstein dead decades earlier. Lucas cooperating from witness protection, Barnes cooperating from witness protection. The next generation, the crack dealers of the 1980s, they had no connection to the old ways, no sense of community responsibility, however twisted, no code, no rules, just violence and money and self-destruction. They'd learned all the wrong lessons. Learned that drug dealing could make you rich, didn't learn about organization, about strategy, about protecting the community even while exploiting it. Just learned that selling poison was profitable. And they did it without conscience, without complexity, without anything except greed. But something had changed. Something fundamental. Something that couldn't be undone even as the specific organizations collapsed. The Italian mob never fully recovered its control over black neighborhoods, never reestablished the hierarchy that Bumpy had worked within, because a generation of black criminals had proven that white oversight wasn't necessary, that black people could run sophisticated criminal operations independently, that the mob's control was based on perception, not reality. And once that perception was broken, it couldn't be restored. Other ethnic groups saw the same thing, saw that the Italian mob's monopoly could be challenged. Latin American drug cartels started operating in the United States Asian gangs, Russian organized crime. Everyone realized that the old structure was collapsing, that the future of crime was multi-ethnic, decentralized, independent, and black gangsters had helped prove it was possible. In legitimate society, things were changing too. The civil rights movement had achieved legal victories. Desegregation, voting rights, anti-discrimination laws. The barriers that had forced people like St. Clair and Holstein and Bumpy into crime were being challenged. Not eliminated, not destroyed, but challenged. Black people could go to better schools, could get better jobs, could access opportunities that previous generations couldn't imagine. The children and grandchildren of the Great Migration, the people who'd come to Harlem seeking something better, were finding it. Not in the underworld, in the legitimate world, becoming doctors, lawyers, business owners, politicians, building wealth legally, achieving power legitimately, proving that the criminal path, however successful individuals became, wasn't the only path, wasn't even the best path. And that raises the question, what if? What if Stephanie St. Clair's brilliance had been applied to legitimate business? What if Bumpy Johnson's strategic intelligence had been used for legal enterprises? What if Frank Lucas's entrepreneurial genius had built legitimate corporations instead of drug empires? What if Nicky Barnes's organizational skills had created legal businesses instead of the council? How much could they have achieved? How much could they have built? How much could they have helped their communities without destroying them? We'll never know, because the system, in their time, didn't offer those options. Didn't allow black excellence to flourish legitimately, forced brilliance into the shadows, into crime, into paths that led to prison or death or betrayal. But by the 1980s and 1990s, those options were starting to exist. Not easily, not without barriers, not without racism and discrimination and all the obstacles that still existed. But they were possible. And that makes the gangster story both more tragic and more heroic. More tragic because they fought and died and destroyed for something that their children could achieve legally. More heroic because their fight, their resistance, their refusal to accept poverty, helped create the conditions that made legitimate success possible for the next generation. The gangsters didn't cause the civil rights movement, didn't lead it, weren't even particularly supportive of it, but they were part of the same impulse, the same refusal to accept white supremacy's limitations, the same insistence on black power and black excellence and black independence, just expressed through crime instead of protest, through organization instead of marches, through building underground economies instead of changing legal ones. Every successful black entrepreneur today stands on foundations built partially by criminals. Not because crime is good, not because we should celebrate it, but because in the absence of legal opportunities, black people built economic infrastructure however they could. And that infrastructure, those networks, those examples of black organizational capacity, they created templates, created proof, created possibilities, showed that black people could build and manage and succeed at complex enterprises. And when legal opportunities finally opened, even partially, black people already knew how to do it. Already had the skills, already had the examples, already had the confidence. Some of that came from legitimate sources, from churches, from schools, from civil rights organizations. But some of it, whether we like it or not, came from watching gangsters build empires, from seeing that black people could organize, could lead, could succeed, even if the success was criminal. So what does it all mean? This 3-hour journey through Harlem's criminal underworld, through numbers rackets and heroin empires, through gangsters who were heroes and villains simultaneously, through resistance and exploitation, through independence and destruction. What are we supposed to take from this? What lessons exist in these complicated, contradictory stories? First, that history is never clean, never simple, never reducible to good guys and bad guys. Stephanie St. Clair fought racist white gangsters, admirable. She also ran an illegal gambling operation that exploited poor people, condemnable. Both things are true. Both things matter. And trying to reduce her to either hero or villain misses the point entirely. She was a human being navigating an impossible situation, making choices that had both positive and negative consequences, surviving in a system designed to destroy her, and her survival, her resistance, her refusal to bow, that matters. Even if the empire she was protecting was built on exploitation, even if her fight preserved something harmful. Because the fight itself, the refusal itself, that had value beyond the immediate circumstances. Second, that survival under oppression requires compromises that look different from the outside than they feel from the inside. Bumpy Johnson's partnership with the mob looks like betrayal from St. Clair's perspective. Looks like selling out. Looks like surrendering everything they'd fought for. But from Bumpy's perspective, it was survival. Was the only way to maintain any black power in Harlem was choosing some independence over none. Some power over no power. Some protection over complete vulnerability. Neither perspective is wrong. Both are valid. and the fact that they're contradictory, that they can't both be right simultaneously. That's the reality of surviving oppression. You make impossible choices. You compromise values to preserve survival. You do things that look like weakness, but feel like strategy. And you live with the guilt and the doubt and the knowledge that maybe there was a better way, but you didn't see it, and you did the best you could with what you had. Third, that systems of oppression force people into positions where all available choices are bad, where crime becomes rational, where exploitation of your own community becomes survival, where poisoning your own people becomes economic opportunity. And while we can judge those choices, while we should acknowledge the harm they caused, we also need to understand the context. Understand that when legitimate paths are blocked, when the legal economy offers nothing but poverty, when the system is designed to keep you down, crime stops being irrational. Becomes a logical response to an irrational situation. That doesn't make it right, doesn't excuse the damage, doesn't absolve responsibility, but it explains it, makes it comprehensible, keeps us from simplistic moral judgments that ignore systemic context. Fourth, that black excellence is real, is undeniable, exists even in the darkest places. Stephanie St. Clair built an empire in the 1920s and 1930s that rivaled anything white gangsters created as a woman, as an immigrant, as someone the system declared worthless. That's excellence. Bumpy Johnson navigated mob politics for decades, built relationships with the most powerful criminals in America, maintained power in a world designed to destroy him. That's excellence. Frank Lucas revolutionized drug trafficking, created supply chains that criminal organizations still study, built an empire from nothing. That's excellence. Nicky Barnes created the Council, an organizational structure sophisticated enough to compete with the Italian mob. That's excellence. None of it is moral excellence. None of it is admirable in the traditional sense. But it's excellence nonetheless. Brilliance applied to evil ends is still brilliance. And recognizing that, acknowledging that black people can be excellent, even in crime, that matters. Because excellence denied in one context gets denied in all contexts. If we can't acknowledge that black criminals were brilliant, were strategic, were capable, then we can't fully acknowledge black capability in legitimate fields either. The recognition of capacity has to be universal, or it's meaningless. Fifth, that representation matters. Even criminal representation. When Dutch Schultz said black gangsters were small-time hustlers who'd never understand real organized crime, he was expressing the dominant view of his era. The belief that black people were incapable of complex organization, incapable of strategic thinking, incapable of building institutions. And every time a black gangster proved him wrong, every time they built something sophisticated, every time they demonstrated capacity, it challenged that narrative, changed perceptions, created possibilities. Yes, it was criminal capacity. Yes, it caused harm. But the demonstration of black organizational ability, even criminal organizational ability, had spillover effects, made it harder to claim black people couldn't run businesses, couldn't manage enterprises, couldn't lead organizations. If black people could run sophisticated criminal operations, the argument that they couldn't run legitimate businesses became less credible. Again, not justification, not celebration, just recognition of complexity, of unintended consequences, of how change happens in messy, contradictory ways. Sixth, that the cost was real, enormous, devastating, and can't be ignored. Thousands of people died from heroin addiction. Tens of thousands had their lives destroyed. Families fell apart. Communities collapsed. Children grew up surrounded by violence and addiction and hopelessness. And black gangsters caused this, not alone. Not entirely, but significantly. They made decisions that prioritized their wealth over community well-being, their power over other people's survival, their success over collective health. And that has to be acknowledged, has to be centered, has to be part of the story. Because any narrative that celebrates black gangster success without acknowledging black gangster damage is propaganda, not history, is entertainment, not truth. The legacy of Harlem's gangsters is complicated, includes both resistance and destruction, both excellence and exploitation, both community protection and community devastation. All of it is true. All of it matters. None of it can be erased to make the story cleaner or more comfortable. And finally, seventh, that we're still grappling with these questions, still trying to understand how to build black power in a system designed to prevent it, still navigating the tension between survival and values, still making impossible choices, still trying to determine what's justified by oppression and what's just exploitation, wearing oppression as an excuse. The gangsters are mostly gone now. The specific organizations they built are destroyed. But the questions they raised, the moral dilemmas they embodied, the contradictions they represented, those remain. How do you build economic power when the legal economy excludes you? How do you maintain values when survival requires compromising them? How do you protect your community when protecting it might mean participating in systems that harm it? How do you be excellent in a society that denies your humanity? How do you survive with dignity when the system is designed to strip both survival and dignity away? These aren't questions with easy answers, aren't questions with single answers, are questions that every generation of Black Americans has had to navigate in different contexts, with different stakes, but always present, always urgent, always impossible. The gangsters of Harlem, from Stephanie St. Clair to Nikki Barnes, they gave their answers, built their empires, made their choices, paid their prices, and left us with examples that are both inspiring and horrifying, both admirable and condemnable, both heroic and villainous. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the lesson isn't that they were right or wrong, good or bad, heroes or villains. Maybe the lesson is that people are complicated, that history is complicated, that resistance is complicated, that survival is complicated, that you can fight against oppression and still cause harm, can build something impressive and still destroy lives, can be brilliant and still be destructive, can be admirable and still be criminal. They told Harlem's gangsters they'd never sit with the mob, that black criminals were small time, that they didn't understand real organization, that they should stay in their place, accept their limitations, know their role. Stephanie St. Clair didn't listen, built an empire, went to war with Dutch Schultz, went to prison rather than surrender, proved that a black woman could be as dangerous, as powerful, as unbreakable as anyone. Casper Holstein didn't listen, built the numbers racket into an economic engine, funded the Harlem Renaissance, proved that criminal profits could create cultural excellence, that black economic power, even illegal economic power, could build institutions that lasted. Bumpy Johnson didn't listen, fought Schultz to a standstill, negotiated partnership with Lucky Luciano, became the first black gangster to sit as something approaching an equal with the Italian mob, proved that black criminals could navigate white power structures, could survive, could thrive. Frank Lucas didn't listen, cut out the mob entirely, built his own supply chain, imported heroin directly from Southeast Asia, proved that black gangsters didn't need white permission to build empires. Nikki Barnes didn't listen, created the Council, built an organization that rivaled the mob, made millions, made himself untouchable for a while, proved that black excellence in crime was as real as black excellence in any other field. They all failed eventually. St. Clair died marginalized, Holstein broken. Bumpy died of a heart attack, his compromise-based empire dying with him. Lucas cooperated. Barnes cooperated. Their empires collapsed, their organizations destroyed, their legacies complicated by betrayal and destruction, and the communities devastated by their products. But they forced their way to the table, proved it could be done, proved that black people could build power even when every system was designed to prevent it. Proved that excellence, even criminal excellence, had no color. Proved that the barriers were real but not permanent. strong but not unbreakable, intimidating but not insurmountable. And improving that in building those empires, enforcing that recognition, they changed organized crime in America. Not single-handedly, not alone, but significantly, meaningfully, undeniably. The mob was never the same after Harlem proved that black gangsters could compete, could organize, could build institutions. The hierarchy that had seemed permanent was revealed as conditional, as vulnerable, as dependent on perception rather than reality. And once that perception broke, once people saw that the system could be challenged, everything changed. Not immediately, not completely, but fundamentally, the cost was enormous. The damage incalculable. The communities devastated. The lives destroyed. The addiction. The violence. The death. All of it real. All of it attributable, at least partially, to the decisions these gangsters made. Decisions to prioritize profit over people, power over community, individual success over collective well-being. That can't be excused, can't be justified, can't be waved away with talk of systemic oppression and limited options. The harm was real. The responsibility was real. The judgment has to be real. But so does the recognition, the acknowledgement, the understanding that these were brilliant people navigating impossible situations, making terrible choices because all the choices were terrible. Building empires because empire building was the only path to power they could see. Destroying communities because the alternative was accepting their own destruction. They weren't heroes, but they weren't simple villains either. They were people, complicated, contradictory, capable of both great things and terrible things, often simultaneously. They changed history, not always for the better, not always in ways we should celebrate, but meaningfully, significantly, in ways that still echo today, in the recognition that black people can build anything, can organize anything, can achieve excellence in any field, even fields we wish didn't exist, even fields that cause harm, even fields that destroy as they build. That's the legacy. Complicated, contradictory, impossible to reduce to simple narratives, impossible to celebrate without acknowledging the cost, impossible to condemn without understanding the context. The story of Harlem's gangsters, from the numbers rackets of the 1920s to the heroin empires of the 1970s, is the story of black resistance expressed through crime, of black excellence demonstrated through destruction, of black power built on black suffering, of independence achieved through exploitation, of brilliance applied to evil, of survival requiring surrender, of fighting the system while reinforcing its worst assumptions, of proving capacity while destroying community, of winning while losing, of losing while winning. They said black gangsters could never deal with the mob, could never sit at the table, could never build real organizations, could never compete at the highest levels. They were wrong. Harlem's gangsters proved them wrong, forced their way to the table, built empires that rivaled anything white criminals created, competed, succeeded, won, for a while, until they didn't, until the system ground them down, until they were arrested, killed, betrayed, forgotten, until their empires collapsed and their communities paid the price, and their legacies became cautionary tales about the cost of criminal success. But they forced their way to the table, and the table was never the same. That's what they gave us. That's what they left behind. That's why we're still talking about them decades after their deaths. Not because they were right, not because they were heroes, not because we should emulate them, but because they were undeniable. We're brilliant, we're complex, we're human. We're survivors in a system designed to kill them. We're builders in a context that offered only destruction. We're excellent in fields we wish they'd never entered. We're proof that black capability exists everywhere, even in darkness, even in crime, even in places we wish it didn't. They forced their way to the table, and we're still learning what that means, still grappling with the contradictions, still trying to understand how to honor the resistance while acknowledging the damage, how to recognize the excellence while condemning the exploitation, how to tell the truth, the whole truth, the complicated, contradictory, impossible truth. That's their legacy. That's their gift. That's what Harlem's gangsters left us. Not easy answers, hard questions, not simple narratives, complex realities, not heroes or villains, human beings who changed the world, for better and for worse, and left us to figure out what it all meant.